Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Netheric Horror. True scary stories, gentle narration, and peaceful dreams begin here. This happened one night not too long after I had moved back to my hometown, specifically to help take care of my grandmother and assist her in the process of moving out of her large family home. I had just finished a shift at work, went and picked up my dogs, and brought them over to my grandmother's house so I could let them out into her backyard to use the bathroom before settling in for the night. Her backyard is fairly large, roughly about a third the size of a football field, with a line of trees positioned along the back fence, separating her property from the neighbors living behind her. There is also a large, dense bush sitting toward the middle of the yard, essentially dividing the space into two separate sections. The only lighting available back there at night comes from the porch lights belonging to the neighboring houses situated behind my grandmother's property, casting a soft, somewhat dim and uneven glow across parts of the yard. My dogs always have a specific habit of walking around behind that large bush to do their business, while I typically stand near the back door, waiting patiently for them to finish. On this particular night, I walked toward the back of the yard as usual, watching my dogs head off toward their usual spot behind the bush, when I suddenly noticed something else out there with us. I use the word thing deliberately, because I genuinely do not have a better word to describe what I saw. It was tall, with unusually long limbs so long and strange that I specifically remember watching it make a slow, deliberate motion, as though it were attempting to reach one of those impossibly elongated limbs over the side fence separating my grandmother's yard from the neighboring property. But then, it noticed me watching. The moment it became aware of my presence, it immediately retracted that long limb back toward its body and shifted into a low, crouched position, something resembling the stance of a cat preparing to remain still and unnoticed. It had positioned itself in a spot where the shadows cast by the surrounding trees fell almost perfectly over its entire body, as though it had deliberately chosen that exact location specifically because the natural shadows there would help conceal it from view. Despite that shadow doing its best to hide the figure from me, I could tell immediately that it was far too large to actually be a cat. My grandmother does have cats of her own living at that house, and I knew for certain that this was not one of them. I could sense, with absolute certainty, that whatever this thing was, it was looking directly at me. I could genuinely feel its eyes fixed on me, staring intently from within that pool of shadow. I swear, even now, that its eyes appeared to be faintly glowing, though the surrounding darkness made it difficult to make out any further specific details about its actual appearance. Standing there in that moment, I found myself trying to talk myself down, telling myself internally that it was probably nothing, that my eyes were simply playing tricks on me in the dim lighting. I had almost managed to fully convince myself of that explanation when one of my dogs suddenly came running back around the side of the bush, only to stop abruptly and leap backward. An actual, visible jump of what looked like about 3 feet, moving away from wherever she had originally been standing. She let out a single sharp bark and then came sprinting straight toward me as fast as she could. My other dog came flying around the bush as well, moving with that same frantic, desperate urgency. At that point, I knew, without any remaining doubt, that there was genuinely something out there with us in that yard. My dogs are the kind that typically run toward people or other animals with excitement and curiosity, never away from something out of pure fear. Seeing both of them react that way, sprinting toward me in obvious terror rather than their usual eager curiosity, told me everything I needed to know. I did not stick around to investigate any further. I got both of my dogs, turned, and got myself out of that backyard as quickly as I possibly could. Later, when I told one of my close friends about everything that had happened that night, She brought up something that genuinely gave me chills as she said it. She reminded me of all the other strange, unexplainable things that had happened to me over the years while growing up in that same town. Incidents I had mostly filed away individually over time without ever really connecting them together into any larger pattern. She looked at me and said, quite plainly, that something seemed to be following me. Hearing her say those specific words sent a genuine shiver straight down my spine. Because as I actually sat there and thought back over everything, I realized just how many strange, unexplainable experiences I had actually accumulated over the years, especially concentrated specifically within that particular town. Thinking back on that night now, with some additional distance and time to reflect on it, several specific details continue to stand out to me as particularly unsettling and difficult to fully explain away. The way that figure retracted its limb the instant it realized I had spotted it suggests a level of awareness and deliberate intention that does not fit comfortably with any kind of ordinary animal behavior. Animals typically do not respond to being noticed with that kind of immediate, calculated repositioning, adjusting their stance specifically to blend more effectively into the surrounding shadows. The specific detail about its limbs also continues to unsettle me whenever I think back on it. The motion I witnessed, that slow, deliberate reaching gesture toward the fence, combined with limbs that appeared unnaturally long compared to what any normal animal or person would have, remains one of the hardest parts of the entire experience to reconcile with any conventional, rational explanation. I have tried many times since that night to think of any animal native to that area, capable of producing that kind of movement, and I have never been able to land on anything that fits. My dog's reaction remains, for me, the single most convincing piece of evidence that something genuinely unusual was present in that yard with us that night. Dogs, especially the ones I own, are naturally curious and confident around unfamiliar animals and people, typically approaching with excitement rather than turning and fleeing in obvious terror. Watching both of them react with that same immediate, unmistakable fear, sprinting away and coming directly to me, rather than continuing to investigate whatever they had originally encountered behind that bush, told me clearly that whatever they had come across back there was not something ordinary or familiar to them either. Since that night, I have found myself thinking more seriously about my friend's comment, wondering whether there might genuinely be some kind of pattern connecting all of the various strange, unexplainable experiences I have had over the years while living in or visiting that particular town. Individually, each of those earlier incidents had always felt like isolated, standalone moments, easy enough to write off individually as coincidence, imagination, or simple misperception. But hearing my friend point out just how frequently these kinds of experiences seem to happen specifically to me, and specifically within that same general location, made me start reconsidering whether there might be something larger and more consistent underlying all of it. I do not have any solid, definitive answer regarding what that specific creature or figure actually was that night in my grandmother's backyard. I have turned the entire memory over in my mind many times since, trying to settle on some kind of rational, natural explanation, whether some unusually large animal I am simply unfamiliar with, or perhaps some combination of unusual lighting and shadow creating a misleading visual impression. But no explanation I have come up with so far fully accounts for every specific detail I remember. The unnaturally long limbs, the deliberate retraction the moment it realized it had been spotted, the faint glowing quality to its eyes, and especially my dog's immediate, unmistakable terror. Since that night, I have become considerably more cautious whenever I take my dogs out into that same backyard after dark, staying closer to the house, keeping a much more alert eye on the tree line and the shadows near that dividing bush, always half expecting to catch sight of that same tall, long-limbed figure crouched somewhere within the darkness, watching. So far, I have not seen it again, though I cannot say the sense of unease from that night has ever fully faded, especially now that my friend's comment continues to echo in the back of my mind every time something even slightly unusual happens while I am back in that town. I still do not know exactly what to make of everything. The creature itself, my dog's reaction, or the broader pattern of strange occurrences my friend pointed out to me afterward. What I do know with complete certainty is that whatever I saw crouched in those shadows that night was not something ordinary, not some harmless neighborhood cat or stray animal simply passing through the yard. It was something else entirely. Something that noticed me the moment I noticed it, and something that both my dogs and I were equally eager to get away from as quickly as possible. I have been living in my grandparents' house for a while now, and the whole time I have had this strong feeling that something is wrong with the place. I feel like it is haunted. I have tried to explain this to my family more than once, but nobody takes me seriously. They just laugh it off, or tell me I am imagining things because I am tired or stressed. But after what happened one night, I do not think I am imagining anything at all. It started with a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and getting out of bed without really thinking about it. It was like my body knew what to do before my brain caught up. Some strange instinct told me to go outside, so I did, without questioning it. I walked through the house in the dark and stepped out into the backyard. It was nighttime, obviously, and the only light came from the small porch light above the back door. Everything past that little circle of light faded into black. I stood there for a moment, completely still. I did not want to move. There was something about the stillness of the yard that felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. Then I heard it. It was not a sound from outside, not wind or an animal or anything like that. It was a voice inside my own head, and it did not feel like my own thoughts. It had this angry, hissing kind of whisper to it, and it kept repeating the same thing over and over: go to the swing, go to the swing, go to the swing. I did not want to listen to it, but somehow my feet were already moving before I decided to move them. I walked across the yard toward the porch swing we have near the side of the house. When I got there, I saw a note sitting on the seat of the swing. I do not know how it got there. I picked it up, and the writing on it was scribbled and messy, almost like it had been written in a hurry or by someone who was shaking while they wrote it. It said, "Does it follow you?" Underneath the words, there was a crude drawing of a short figure with unnaturally long arms so long they nearly dragged on the ground in the drawing. It should have terrified me right away, but strangely, it did not. In the dream, it felt normal to be standing there holding that note, staring at that drawing. My mind did not panic. It just accepted it, the way dreams sometimes let you accept things that make no sense. The next thing I knew, I had this sudden urge, almost like a pull, to walk toward the tree in the darkest corner of our yard. That corner has always been the darkest part of the property, even during the day, because of how the branches hang low and block out the light. At night it was almost pitch black there, but I walked toward it anyway, without any hesitation, as if my legs already knew the way. The voice came back into my head as I got closer to the tree, and this time it said, "Look at the tree. Look at the tree." Over and over again, the same angry whisper as before. So I looked, and there, on the trunk of the tree, was another note. I picked it up and saw the same drawing as before, the short figure with the long arms that nearly touched the ground. Under the drawing were more scribbled words. This time it said, He is watching you. The second I read those words, something shifted in me. A wave of pure adrenaline shot through my entire body, so intense and so real that it felt nothing like a normal dream. It felt like my body was actually there, actually in danger, actually about to be caught by something. I dropped the paper right where I stood and turned and ran. I ran across the yard toward the back door as fast as I could, threw the door open, and sprinted down the hallway to my room, which is the first room on the right as soon as you walk in through that door. I slammed the door shut behind me, jumped into bed, and pulled the blanket completely over my body, covering myself from head to toe like a kid hiding from a monster in the closet. That is where the dream, if it even was just a dream, seemed to end. And that is also where things get strange. Because what happened next did not feel like a dream at all. I woke up to the sound of the back door slamming open, loud and fast, like someone was rushing to get inside the house in a hurry. Right after that, I heard footsteps, quick ones, moving down the hallway just outside my bedroom door. My whole body was still covered by my comforter, the same way it had been in the dream, which is something that still bothers me to this day, because I do not remember pulling it over myself again after waking up. I looked over at my phone on the nightstand, and the screen read exactly 3 in the morning. 3 a.m. Exactly. Not 2:58, not 3:02, exactly 3. I remember lying there thinking, who could possibly be up and rushing around the house at 3 in the morning? It did not make sense for anyone in my family to be moving that fast, that late, unless something was wrong. So I got up to go check, moving quickly because I was worried, but also still half caught in that leftover fear from the dream. Here is where things got a little more complicated for me physically. I have orthostatic hypotension, which means when I stand up quickly, my blood pressure drops, and it takes my body a moment to catch up, since the blood does not reach my head fast enough. In my hurry to get up, I completely forgot about this, and standing up so fast triggered what is called an ocular migraine, which messes with your vision temporarily. So the moment I stepped out into the hallway, my sight started to blur and shimmer at the edges, almost like looking through broken glass or heat waves. The hallway was dark, except for the kitchen light glowing at the far end of it. With my vision going strange on me, I did not trust myself to walk normally without falling over. So I pressed my back and shoulder against the wall to steady myself and just stood there, waiting for my eyes to clear up. It took around 15 seconds or so before the worst of it started to fade, and I could see somewhat normally again. Once my vision settled, I looked down the length of the hallway toward the kitchen light. And that is when I heard footsteps again, coming from somewhere near the kitchen. I wanted to call out, to yell for my mom or dad, but I stopped myself because I did not want to wake up the rest of the house over what might have just been nothing. So instead, I just stood frozen against that wall, too afraid to actually walk toward the kitchen to see who or what was making that sound. I remember looking over at the light switch in the kitchen from where I stood, just watching it, half expecting to see someone flip it. And then, without anyone visibly touching it, the kitchen light switched off, just like that. 1 second it was on, lighting up the end of the hallway, and the next second the whole house was dark, except for the dim shape of everything around me. That was the moment I completely lost it. Full panic took over. I turned and ran back into my room as fast as I could, closed the door, and stood with my back pressed against it, like I was trying to physically block anything from getting in. I did not move a single muscle for what felt like a long time. I was too scared to even breathe normally. After standing there for about a minute, my heart pounding the entire time, I finally worked up the nerve to move away from the door and get back into bed. I pulled the covers up again, but sleep would not come. I lay there wide awake, staring into the dark. listening for any more sounds, any more footsteps, anything at all. I stayed like that for almost an hour, completely unable to close my eyes, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. At some point after that hour of lying there awake, I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember is waking up around 10:30 in the morning. I do not remember drifting off. I do not remember feeling tired enough to fall asleep. One moment I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, and the next thing I knew it was already late morning and sunlight was coming through the curtains. There was no in-between that I can recall, no slow drift into sleep, just a gap in time that I cannot account for. To this day, I still do not know what to make of any of it. Was the whole thing just a dream from start to finish, including the back door slamming and the footsteps and the light turning off? Or did the dream end at some point and something real happen after that? In my actual house, in the actual hallway outside my actual bedroom. I go back and forth on it, but there is a part of me that does not fully believe it was all imagined, especially the part about waking up already covered by my blanket, exactly the way I had pulled it over myself at the end of the dream. That detail alone is something I cannot explain away, no matter how many times I try to convince myself it was nothing. My family still does not believe that this house has anything strange going on in it. They think I am just imagining things or letting my nerves get the better of me late at night. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, and I know how real that fear felt when I was standing in that hallway with my vision blurring and the kitchen light going dark right in front of me. Whether it was a dream, a sleep episode brought on by my blood pressure condition, or something else entirely living in that house with us, I honestly cannot say for certain. All I know is that this still freaks me out to this day, and I do not think I will ever be able to walk down that hallway at 3 in the morning again without feeling like something is watching from just out of sight. I do not know if I would call this the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, but it definitely creeps me out whenever I think about it. The whole thing started because I live fairly close to a Walmart. It is close enough that whenever I only need to pick up a few things, I usually do not bother driving. I can just walk there. The route is not exactly ideal, though. There is a trail that leads toward the store, but instead of taking you directly to the front entrance, it brings you around the back. From there, you have to walk along the side of the building before you finally reach the main entrance. The strange thing about the area is that there are patches of woods and overgrown ground around the back and side of the store. I would not call it a deep forest. It is more like a forested strip surrounding the property. There are trees, bushes, and dark areas where the store lights do not reach very well. During the day, it is not especially frightening. People walk through there. You can hear cars in the parking lot. You know a giant Walmart is only a short distance away. But at night, it feels completely different. The back of the store is much quieter than the front. There are no bright signs or streams of customers walking around. You mostly see loading areas, blank walls, dumpsters, and trees. The trail itself can become very dark. Normally, I did not think too much about it. I had walked that way before. It was simply the fastest route. One night, my boyfriend and I decided to walk to Walmart because we wanted to buy a few things to make root beer floats. It was one of those completely ordinary little trips. We were not looking for anything strange. We were not talking about ghosts or monsters. We were just going to buy ice cream and root beer. It was already dark outside by the time we left. We walked toward the trail like usual. Nothing seemed wrong. The weather was normal. The area was quiet, but not unusually so. As we made our way up the trail toward the back of Walmart, we noticed something ahead of us. There was a dog. At least, that was what we thought it was. It was black. Completely black. It was standing near the trail, sniffing around the ground like a normal dog would. At first, I did not think there was anything unusual about it. Dogs get loose. People let their pets wander. Sometimes strays hang around places where they might find food. A Walmart parking lot or loading area probably has plenty of interesting smells for an animal. So we kept walking. The dog did not immediately react to us. It seemed focused on whatever it was smelling. Because it was dark, I could not make out many details. I could see the general shape. 4 legs. Body, head, it looked like a dog. But it was difficult to tell what breed it might have been. The darkness around it seemed to swallow the details. I made a joke. I said something like, "What if it's some kind of creature?" I was not serious. It was the kind of dumb joke people make when they are walking through a dark area and see something they cannot fully identify. I expected my boyfriend to laugh. Maybe the dog would continue sniffing around. That should have been the end of it. But the exact moment I said it, the dog suddenly whipped its head around. It looked directly at us. The timing was so perfect that it immediately made me uncomfortable. It was almost as though it had understood what I said. Of course, dogs react to voices all the time. That is not strange by itself. We had been talking. Maybe the sound finally caught its attention. There was nothing impossible about that. But something about the way it moved felt wrong. 1 second, it was calmly sniffing the ground. The next, its entire attention was on us. Then it ran. And that was when the experience stopped feeling normal. I have seen dogs run before. Everyone has. Dogs can be incredibly fast. Some breeds are built for speed. Even an ordinary house dog can surprise you when it suddenly takes off. But this did not look like normal running. The animal moved faster than any dog I had ever seen. It was almost ridiculous. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like something out of a superhero movie. One moment, the dog was there. Then, it shot away. It covered the distance so quickly that I barely understood what I was seeing. My first thought was basically, what the hell was that? My boyfriend had seen it too. So I knew I had not imagined the movement. We both watched the dog disappear into the darkness. For a moment, we stood there trying to understand what we had just seen. Then, because nothing else happened, we continued walking. We still needed our root beer float supplies. The whole thing became a weird little story. We had seen a strange black dog behind Walmart that apparently ran like the Flash. That was it. At least, that was what I thought. If the story had ended there, I probably would have forgotten most of it. Maybe the dog was just unusually fast. Maybe the darkness made it seem quicker than it really was. Maybe because it surprised us, our perception of the moment was distorted. There were plenty of explanations. Then, a couple of months later, I was talking to one of my neighbors. I do not remember exactly how the subject came up. Maybe we were talking about the area around Walmart. Maybe we were discussing strange things we had seen nearby. But she mentioned something that immediately got my attention. She said that she and her son had seen a creepy black dog roaming around behind Walmart. The moment she said it, I thought about the animal my boyfriend and I had seen. Still, I told myself it could not possibly be the same dog. There were plenty of black dogs in the world. A stray could easily stay around the same area for months. Maybe people were feeding it. Maybe it lived somewhere nearby. There was no reason to jump to anything strange. So I listened. Then my neighbor described what happened when the dog noticed them. According to her, the moment it realized they were there, it ran away. Fast. Extremely fast. She described it as taking off at almost the speed of light. That was when I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. The story was too similar. She had not been there when my boyfriend and I saw the dog. As far as I know, I had never told her about our experience, yet she was describing the same thing. A black dog. Behind Walmart, creepy appearance. Then the strange burst of impossible-looking speed. I asked myself the obvious question. Was it really the same dog? It had been months. A normal stray animal could absolutely remain in one area for that long. But the speed was what bothered me. What were the chances that both of us happened to see an unusually dark dog in the same location, and both of us independently noticed that it ran faster than any normal dog should? Maybe it was coincidence. That was still the explanation I preferred. There are fast dogs. Maybe the terrain made it seem faster. Maybe the darkness created an illusion. I tried not to think about it too much. Then, a few weeks later, my boyfriend came home. He looked unsettled. Not joking, not amused. He seemed genuinely nervous. He told me he had seen the dog again. The same black dog. Near Walmart. Again, at that point, the whole thing started to feel much harder to dismiss. This was no longer a single strange sighting. It was becoming a pattern. My boyfriend and I had seen it together. My neighbor and her son had seen something matching the same description. Then, my boyfriend saw it again, weeks later. Always in the same general area. Always behind Walmart. Always near that wooded strip. And each time, there was something about the animal that felt wrong. The thing I have struggled to explain is its color. Calling it a black dog does not really describe what I mean. Black dogs exist. Their fur may be very dark. In low light, they can look almost like shadows. That is normal. This dog did not seem black in that way. It looked black in the way darkness itself is black. The closest description I can give is an absence of light. A void. Like someone had cut a dog-shaped hole into the world. That sounds dramatic, I know. But every time I try to remember what it looked like, that is the image that comes to mind. It was not simply that its fur was black. It was that I could not see any texture in it. No shine. No variation. No clear details. Just a dog-shaped darkness. Maybe that was because of the lighting. The area behind Walmart was poorly lit. The dog itself was standing near the edge of a wooded area. Dark fur in low light can easily lose detail. That is the logical explanation. But something about it still looked different. Normally, even a black dog reflects some light. You see the shape of the muscles. You see parts of the face. You can make out the eyes. Sometimes you see a shine in the fur. With this thing, I remember almost none of that. It was simply black. Too black. I have tried to decide whether my memory changed after the later sightings. Maybe the first time we saw the dog, it looked completely normal. Then after hearing my neighbor's story and hearing that my boyfriend had seen it again, my mind turned it into something stranger. Memory does that. People change details without realizing it. I understand that. But I also remember feeling uncomfortable with the animal before any of those other stories happened. The speed was strange from the beginning. The way it reacted the exact moment I joked about it being some sort of creature was strange. Then there was the darkness of its shape. All of those things stood out before I knew anyone else had seen it. I still walk through that area sometimes. Whenever I do, I find myself looking toward the woods. I tell myself I am not searching for the dog. But I am. Part of me expects to see that shape again, standing near the trail, sniffing the ground. Waiting, the whole area feels different now. Before, it was simply the back of a Walmart, an ugly loading area beside some trees. Now, whenever I pass through there at night, I think about all the places something could be standing without being seen. The tree line is dark. The store blocks some of the light. The trail creates this narrow path between civilization and the woods. On one side, there's a massive retail store full of people and fluorescent lights. On the other, there is darkness. Maybe that contrast is part of what makes the place feel strange. You know there are hundreds of people only a short distance away. But behind the building, you can feel completely alone. I sometimes wonder whether the dog lives somewhere in those woods. Maybe there is a completely normal explanation. A large stray, maybe a mixed breed. Naturally fast, very dark fur. It could have learned to avoid people. That would explain why it runs the moment someone notices it. Maybe it spends its time around Walmart because there is food nearby. Dumpsters, trash, people dropping things. Stray animals often learn where to find easy meals. That explanation makes sense. It explains almost everything. Almost the problem is the way everyone describes the speed. My neighbor did not simply say the dog ran away. She specifically commented on how unbelievably fast it moved. My boyfriend noticed the same thing. So did I. That is the detail we all remembered. Maybe we all exaggerated. Maybe the dog was some breed known for speed. Maybe the visual conditions created the same illusion for everyone. I would like to believe that. But there is something unsettling about several people independently having the same reaction to the same animal. I also wonder what happened during my boyfriend's later encounter. He came home in a panic. That is not how someone reacts after seeing an ordinary stray dog. Maybe he was already thinking about our first experience. Maybe seeing the dog again triggered the memory and made everything feel worse. That is possible. Once you decide something is creepy, seeing it again naturally becomes more frightening. But still, the fact that it returned bothered both of us. Why was it always there? Why did it seem to disappear for weeks or months and then come back? Was it actually living nearby? Was someone feeding it? Did it belong to someone? I have never seen anyone walking it. I have never seen a collar. I have never seen it during the day. That does not mean no one else has. I only know about the sightings people told me about. All of them seem to happen around the back of Walmart, that wooded area, that trail, that dark strip along the side of the store. Part of me is curious. Another part of me does not want to know. Imagine if I tried to follow it. That would be stupid. I already know how fast it is. There is no chance I could keep up. And honestly, even if I could, I do not think I would want to discover where it goes. Maybe it would lead to a house, maybe a homeless camp, maybe some hidden place where stray animals stay. That would be reassuring. Or maybe it would disappear into the trees and leave me standing there alone in the dark. No thanks. I have read stories about black dogs before. Not because of this experience originally, but afterward I became more interested in the idea. Different cultures have stories about mysterious black dogs appearing at night. Some are supposed to be bad omens. Some guard certain places. Others are described as supernatural creatures. I do not know what I believe about any of that. I am not saying this animal was some legendary creature. I am definitely not saying it was a demon. It could very easily have been a normal dog. But I understand now how stories like that begin. Imagine living hundreds of years ago. No streetlights, no cars, no Walmart. You are walking alone at night. Then you see something shaped like a dog, completely black. It looks at you. Then it moves faster than anything you have ever seen. You go home and tell people. Someone else sees it later. Then another person. Eventually, the normal explanations disappear and a legend begins. Maybe that is all we are doing here. Seeing a weird animal and turning it into something more frightening because humans love stories. That is possible. But when I remember it turning its head toward us, I still get uncomfortable. The timing was perfect. What if it's some sort of creature? Whip. Its head turned. For 1 second, it stared directly at us. Then, it was gone. Fast. Almost impossibly fast. It felt like I had said something I should not have said. Like I had acknowledged it. Like it realized we were paying attention. Again, I know how that sounds. A dog probably heard my voice. That is all. But in the moment, it felt different. Maybe that is why the memory stayed with me. It was the exact kind of timing that makes your imagination take over. You joke about something being a creature. Then, it reacts. If it had looked at us 10 seconds earlier or later, maybe I would not remember the encounter so clearly. The coincidence gave the moment meaning. Then the later sightings added more. My neighbor's story especially bothered me because she had her son with her. She had no reason to make the dog sound strange. She simply described what they saw. And her description matched ours. The location, the appearance, the speed. That was when the whole thing stopped feeling like a private joke between my boyfriend and me. Someone else had seen it. Then my boyfriend saw it again. That confirmed, at the very least, that there really was some kind of black dog staying around the area. Unless we were all imagining the same thing, something was there. The question is what? A normal dog? Probably a strangely fast, unusually dark stray? Maybe something else? I honestly do not know. I think the hardest part to explain is that void-like color. I wish I could describe it better. Imagine a black dog standing at night. Normally, you would see a darker shape against the background, but this thing almost seemed to remove the background. Where the dog stood, there was nothing. No light, no detail, just blackness. Dog-shaped blackness. I remember thinking that if it closed its eyes and stood still in the right place, you might not notice it at all. Maybe that is why it is difficult to know how often it is actually around. Maybe it watches people from the edge of the woods. That thought creeps me out. Not because I think it is planning anything, just because the idea of something standing silently in darkness, almost impossible to see, is uncomfortable. What if we only notice it when it wants us to? That is the kind of thought I try not to entertain. Because once you start thinking like that, every shadow becomes the dog. Every movement near the trees becomes something watching you. I prefer the normal explanation. There is a stray black dog living near Walmart. It is naturally fast. The lighting makes it look darker than it really is. Several people have happened to see it. That is probably the truth. But even if that is the truth, it is still the strangest dog I have ever seen. I have never forgotten how it moved. 1 second there. The next, gone. I have never seen another dog run like that. Maybe someone with more experience around fast breeds would laugh at me. Maybe it was a greyhound mix or something similar. I would honestly welcome that explanation. The problem is that I did not get a good enough look at its shape to identify a breed. The darkness erased too much. All I saw was something roughly dog-shaped. Black, still then, suddenly moving at an unbelievable speed. Sometimes I think about taking the trail at night specifically to see if it appears again. Then I remember that I am not a horror movie character. There is no reason to investigate. If a weird dog wants to live behind Walmart, it can have the place. I am not going into the woods after it. I am definitely not getting close enough to see whether its fur is actually normal. Curiosity has limits. The funny thing is that nothing bad ever actually happened. The dog never attacked anyone. It never chased us. It never growled. It never even came closer. Every time someone noticed it, it ran away. If anything, maybe the dog was afraid of us. That would be the simplest explanation of all. A terrified stray sees people and bolts. Maybe it has been abused. Maybe it does not trust humans. Maybe the extreme speed is just adrenaline. That makes the whole story less scary. But it does not make it less strange, because I still cannot get over that color, or that first moment, my stupid joke. The sudden turn of its head, that look, then the impossible burst of movement, and then months later, hearing someone else describe almost the exact same experience without knowing what we had seen. I do not know if the dog is still around. Maybe someone eventually took it in. Maybe animal control caught it. Maybe it moved somewhere else. Maybe it was never there as often as it seemed. I have not heard anything about it recently. But whenever I walk behind that Walmart after dark, I pay attention. I look toward the tree line. I look near the bushes. I watch the places where the store lights fade into darkness. Most nights, there is nothing. Just trees. Trash. Shopping carts. The normal, ugly backside of a giant store. But every once in a while, when I see a patch of darkness that seems slightly too dark, I stop for half a second. And I wonder, is that a shadow? Or is it shaped like a dog? I still have no idea what we saw. Maybe a completely normal animal. Maybe the same stray appearing again and again. Maybe there is nothing mysterious about it at all. But I know what my boyfriend and I saw that first night. I know what my neighbor described months later. And I know how my boyfriend looked when he came home after seeing it again. 3 separate encounters. The same area. The same black dog. The same impossible speed. That is enough to make me uncomfortable. The best description I have is still the same. It was not black like fur. It was black like the absence of light. Like a piece of nothing had taken the shape of a dog and decided to wander around behind Walmart. And whenever someone noticed it, it ran. This is not exactly a scary story in the traditional sense. There were no ghosts, no monsters, and nothing obviously supernatural. It is just something that happened to me that I still cannot explain. And honestly, the older I get, the more it bothers me. Some of the details are a little unclear because I had been drinking heavily that night. I want to be honest about that from the beginning. I was very intoxicated, so I know my memory cannot be completely trusted. There are probably gaps in what I remember, and some events may have happened differently than the way they felt to me at the time. Still, there are certain parts I remember very clearly. And no matter how many times I try to make sense of them, I cannot. This happened when I went down to Toronto for a concert. I had been looking forward to the night, and like a lot of people do at concerts. I drank far too much. I do not remember exactly how many drinks I had, probably more than I should have. By the end of the night, I was completely wasted. Not just a little drunk. I mean, heavily intoxicated. My memory from the earlier part of the evening is mostly a blur of the concert. Crowds, noise, alcohol, and moving from one place to another. At some point, I ended up being stopped by people I believed were police officers. I say believed because that is where the strange part of the story begins. At the time, I did not question them. As far as I was concerned, they were police. They acted like police. They told me I was under arrest. They said they were taking me to the drunk tank. Honestly, that did not seem like a huge deal to me. I had been very drunk before. I knew I was intoxicated. I was not exactly in a condition to argue with anyone about whether I should be taken somewhere to sober up. If the police wanted to put me in a drunk tank for the night, I figured I would sleep it off, wake up with a terrible hangover, and deal with whatever happened in the morning. I was annoyed, maybe embarrassed, but I was not frightened. At least, not yet. There is one detail I forgot to mention at first, and it became much more important when I thought about everything later. The vehicle they put me in was unmarked. It was not a normal police cruiser. At the time, I did not think much of it. Police sometimes use unmarked cars. I knew that. So when they put me in the back, I did not immediately think something was wrong. I was also far too drunk to carefully inspect the vehicle or ask intelligent questions about where we were going. I got into the car. Then, sometime during the drive, I passed out. I do not know how long I was unconscious. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been an hour. I honestly have no idea. When I woke up, the vehicle had stopped. The people I thought were police officers woke me and got me out. That was when I noticed we were not at a normal police station. At least, it did not look like any police station I had ever seen. We were outside some kind of large building. The best way I can describe it is that it looked a little like a warehouse. It was not the kind of place I expected to be taken after being arrested for public intoxication. I remember looking at the building and feeling confused, but again, I was so drunk that my brain was not working normally. Everything seemed distant. I was aware that something was unusual, but I did not have enough focus to become seriously alarmed. Maybe I thought the drunk tank was inside some separate facility. Maybe it was a temporary holding center. Maybe Toronto had some system I did not know about. There were plenty of explanations. So I went inside. That was when things became even stranger. The interior of the building did not feel like a police station. It felt more like a hospital. There were people who looked like medical staff, nurses, or at least people dressed in a way that made me think they were nurses. There was equipment. There was a clinical feeling to the place. I remember being confused about why I had been brought there, but I still did not panic. Maybe the police were taking me to be medically cleared before putting me in a cell. That would make sense. If someone is extremely intoxicated, the police might want to make sure they are not suffering from alcohol poisoning or some other medical problem. That is what I told myself. The people I believed were police officers left me there. They did not stay. Again, that felt strange. But I was surrounded by people who appeared to be medical professionals, so I assumed I was safe. Then they started taking blood. At first, that did not seem too strange either. Maybe they were checking my blood alcohol level. Maybe they wanted to make sure there were no dangerous substances in my system. I had been drinking heavily, so I understood why someone might want to do medical tests. But the amount of blood they seemed to take felt excessive. It was not one small vial. At least, that is not how I remember it. They took what seemed like a lot. A weird amount. More than I would normally expect during a basic blood test. I remember watching them filling tubes and thinking that it seemed like too much. But I was so drunk that even then, I did not fully react. My brain kept finding excuses. Maybe they needed several tests. Maybe I was remembering it incorrectly. Maybe it only seemed like a lot because I was intoxicated. I was not worried enough to resist. The medical-looking staff continued doing whatever they were doing. I do not remember anyone explaining things clearly. Maybe they did, and I forgot. That is possible. Maybe they told me exactly where I was and why I was there. If they did, that memory is gone. What I remember is confusion. Then, the people who looked like nurses led me into another room. This room looked more like a bedroom, or maybe a small hospital room. I assumed they wanted me to sleep there. That made sense. I was supposed to be sobering up after all. Maybe this was some kind of medical drunk tank where intoxicated people were observed overnight instead of being put in jail cells. That explanation seemed reasonable. For a moment, I thought the strange night was almost over. I would lie down. I would sleep. I would wake up the next morning and figure everything out. Then, a large man appeared. The best way I can describe him is that he looked more like a bouncer than a nurse. Big, strong, the kind of person who looked like his job was to physically control people. Without much warning, he grabbed me. He slammed me onto the floor. Then he picked me up or forced me onto the bed. That was the moment when I finally realized something was seriously wrong. I had been cooperative, at least as far as I remember. I was drunk, but I was not fighting anyone. I had not attacked the staff. I had not tried to escape. There was no reason, in my mind, for someone to suddenly throw me to the ground. Before I could understand what was happening, they began strapping me to the bed. Not one strap, not two. There were straps across my entire body. 7 or 8 of them, from what I remember. Maybe more. They went across different parts of me, holding me completely still. My arms, my torso, my legs. I could barely move. Suddenly, I was no longer a drunk person being taken somewhere to sleep. I was restrained. Completely, then they left me alone. The room was dark, pitch black. I could not move. That was when I finally lost it. All the calm excuses I had been making disappeared. The unmarked car, the strange warehouse-looking building, the hospital interior, the large amount of blood, the man slamming me to the floor, the straps. Now I was alone in the dark. I started freaking out. Completely, I yelled. I struggled against the restraints. I pulled as hard as I could. Nothing moved. The straps held me tightly. I remember the panic building very quickly. Being drunk made everything worse. My thoughts were not clear enough for me to calmly analyze the situation. All I understood was that I was trapped. Someone had taken me somewhere I did not recognize. They had drawn a lot of blood. Then they had strapped me to a bed and left me alone in darkness. At that point, I had no idea what they planned to do to me. I started imagining everything. Maybe these people were not police. Maybe the medical staff were not real nurses. Maybe I had been kidnapped. Maybe they had drugged me. Maybe they were going to come back and do something worse. I could not move enough to defend myself. I could not reach a phone. I could not see the door. I had no idea where the building was. I did not even know what part of Toronto I was in. I screamed for someone to let me out. I do not know if anyone answered. I do not remember hearing anyone. That made the situation even more frightening. There is something horrible about being trapped in complete darkness while not knowing whether anyone is listening. I had no sense of time. Maybe I was there for 20 minutes, maybe several hours. Everything became disconnected. Eventually, whether because of the alcohol, exhaustion, or something else, I passed out. That is where my memory completely stops. There is nothing between being strapped to that bed and waking up somewhere completely different. When I opened my eyes again, I was outside. Not outside the strange building. Not at a police station. Not in a hospital. I was lying in bushes. And nearby was a Burger King. I remember waking up and trying to understand where I was. I felt terrible. Hungover, confused, probably still partly intoxicated. My body hurt. My memory was fragmented. For a while, I just tried to piece together what had happened. I had gone to a concert. I had been drinking. The police had arrested me. I had been put in an unmarked car. I had passed out. I had woken up at a strange building. People had taken blood. A large man had thrown me down. I had been strapped to a bed. Then, nothing. Now I was in bushes beside Burger King. There was no explanation. No police officer waiting nearby. No hospital paperwork. No one telling me I had been released. No memory of leaving the building. Nothing. I checked myself. At first, I thought maybe I had been robbed. That would have been a simple explanation. Maybe someone had attacked me and dumped me there. But I still had my phone. I checked my wallet. It was still there, too. Inside was around $15. Not much money, but no one had taken it. My identification was still there. As far as I could tell, nothing important had been stolen. That made the situation even stranger. If I had been mugged, why leave my phone? Why leave my wallet? Why leave the money? If the police had released me, why was I in bushes? If I had somehow walked there on my own, why did I remember absolutely nothing about leaving the facility? I tried to reconstruct the missing hours. Maybe I had simply blacked out. That was possible. I had been extremely drunk. Alcohol can destroy memory. Maybe I had been released from a legitimate medical facility. Maybe someone explained everything to me. Maybe I signed paperwork. Maybe I walked out. Maybe I wandered around until I collapsed near Burger King. That could have happened. But then I remembered the restraints, the dark room, the blood, the man throwing me onto the floor. None of it fit comfortably with the idea of a normal night in a drunk tank. I started wondering if my friends knew anything. When I eventually told them what happened, some of them thought I had been drugged. That explanation has always stayed with me. Maybe someone put something in my drink at the concert. Maybe the people who picked me up really were police, and they found me acting strangely. Maybe the strange facility was a hospital or detox center. Maybe the amount of blood was normal because they were testing me for drugs. Maybe the restraints were used because I became violent or unstable and simply do not remember it. That is possible. I want to be fair about that. I had been drinking heavily. My memory was unreliable. Maybe I was much more aggressive than I remember. Maybe the staff had a legitimate reason to restrain me. Maybe I had been yelling, fighting, or trying to hurt myself. If so, I do not remember any of it. From my point of view, I had been cooperative until the large man suddenly attacked me. But an intoxicated person's version of events is not always accurate. I understand that. Still, the ending bothers me. How did I get from that bed to the bushes? Who removed the straps? Who took me out of the building? Was I transported again? Did someone drop me off? Did I leave on my own? Why do I remember nothing? I have tried to tell myself there is a simple explanation. Maybe there is. Maybe this story is nothing more than alcohol, poor memory, and a legitimate medical detox experience that felt sinister because I was confused. But certain details do not leave me alone. The unmarked car. I remember that clearly. Maybe they were plainclothes officers. Maybe Toronto police used unmarked vehicles for some reason. That is possible. But at the time, I never saw a marked police car. Then, there was the building. It looked like a warehouse from outside. Inside, it felt like a hospital. Maybe it was a specialized medical facility. Again, possible. Then the blood. Why did they take so much? Maybe they did not. Maybe my drunk brain exaggerated the amount. A few tubes can look like a lot when you are not thinking clearly. Then, the restraints. 7 or 8 straps. That seems extreme. But maybe I had become dangerous. Maybe I had tried to get up repeatedly. Maybe I was a risk to myself. I cannot know, because my memory is incomplete. Then waking up outside. That is the part I cannot explain. If it was a normal hospital or police procedure, I would expect to wake up there. Or at least be released through a front door, not regain consciousness in bushes beside a fast food restaurant. Sometimes I wonder whether I escaped. Maybe I somehow got free. Maybe I ran. Maybe I wandered through the city without forming memories. It is possible. Severe intoxication can create blackouts, where a person is awake and functioning, but remembers nothing later. Maybe I walked for hours. Maybe I climbed into the bushes myself. If that happened, there might be nothing mysterious about the story at all. The terrifying part would simply be realizing how much time I lost. But there is another possibility I do not like thinking about. What if the people who picked me up were not police officers? What if I only assumed they were? I was drunk. They had authority. They told me I was being arrested. Maybe I never saw badges clearly. Maybe I never looked at identification. Maybe the unmarked car was not a police vehicle at all. That thought is disturbing. If they were not police, then who were they? Why take me to that building? Why draw blood? Why restrain me? And why leave me near Burger King afterward without taking my wallet or phone? That explanation creates more questions than answers. It is probably less likely than the simple explanation that I was taken to some kind of medical detox facility. Still, the thought has crossed my mind many times. I have wondered whether I could have figured out the truth afterward. Maybe I could have contacted the police, asked whether I had been arrested that night, checked for records, found out where intoxicated people were taken in Toronto. Maybe I could have searched for the hospital. But at the time, I mostly wanted to forget the whole thing. I was embarrassed. I had been incredibly drunk. I did not want to explain to people that I had lost several hours of memory. And part of me was afraid of what I might discover. What if there was no arrest record? What if no police officer had taken me anywhere? What if the place I remembered did not exist? At the same time, I also worried that there was a very simple explanation, and I would look like an idiot. Maybe I had been taken to a legitimate detox center. Maybe I had caused a scene. Maybe I had been restrained because I was acting dangerously. Then, after sobering up, maybe I left and blacked out again. It would still be disturbing, but not mysterious. So I never really investigated. I just carried the memory with me. Over time, parts of it became hazier, but the strongest images remained. The blackness inside the room, the straps across my body, the feeling of pulling against them and realizing I could not move. The panic, then nothing, then bushes, daylight, Burger King, my phone still in my pocket, my wallet still there, $15 untouched. It is one of those memories that feels almost like a dream. Sometimes I wonder whether parts of it were a dream. Maybe after being arrested, I was taken somewhere normal and passed out. Maybe my brain created the hospital, the blood, and the restraints while I was unconscious. But I remember the fear too clearly. I remember the feeling of the straps. I remember the large man forcing me onto the bed. I remember yelling in the dark. Maybe dreams can feel that real. I know they can. But something inside me still believes it happened. My friends think I may have been drugged. That would explain some things. If someone had put something in my drink, maybe the combination with alcohol caused extreme confusion and memory loss. Maybe I behaved unpredictably. Maybe the police found me and brought me to a medical facility. Maybe staff took blood because they were trying to determine what was in my system. Maybe I became aggressive and needed to be restrained. That is honestly one of the most reasonable explanations. But again, why did I wake up in bushes? Maybe I was discharged while still confused. Maybe I walked away. Maybe someone dropped me there. I do not know. The truth is that I will probably never know exactly what happened that night. Too much time has passed. My memory was already unreliable from the beginning. I had been drinking far too much. There may be important events I completely forgot. There may be explanations that would make the entire thing sound ordinary. I accept that. But whenever I think about it, I still feel uncomfortable. Not because I believe I was abducted by some secret organization. Not because I think something supernatural happened. Because for several hours of my own life, I have almost no idea where I was or what was happening to me. I remember enough to know that I was frightened. Then there's a blank space. And when that blank space ends, I am lying in bushes beside Burger King. That is a deeply unsettling feeling. Most of us move through life believing we understand where we are. We know how we got somewhere. We remember going to sleep. We remember waking up. Even when we drink, there is usually some sense of continuity. That night had none. Concert, alcohol, police, unmarked car, strange building. Blood, restraints, darkness, nothing, bushes. That is the entire sequence in my mind. I have no bridge connecting those last two places. Sometimes I imagine myself still strapped to the bed. Then I imagine opening my eyes. But instead of being in that room, I am outside. It feels like someone cut a section out of the night. Maybe that missing section contains the explanation. Maybe I woke up. Maybe someone released me. Maybe I walked out the front door. Maybe I wandered through Toronto for an hour. Maybe I collapsed near the restaurant. If I could remember that part, the mystery might disappear. But I cannot. So the questions remain. Were those people really police? What was that building? Why did it look like a warehouse outside and a hospital inside? Why were they taking my blood? Why did they take so much? Why was I strapped down so heavily? What happened after I passed out? And how did I end up outside beside a Burger King with all my belongings still on me? I have no answer. Maybe my friends are right. Maybe I was drugged. Maybe it was only alcohol. Maybe it was a normal detox facility seen through the confused mind of someone completely intoxicated. I honestly hope that is all it was. Because the alternative is that one night in Toronto, I got into an unmarked car with people I thought were police, was taken to a building I could not identify, had blood taken from me, was restrained in darkness, lost several hours of memory, and woke up dumped in bushes without ever learning why. Even today, when I think about it, I cannot decide which explanation bothers me more. The only time in my life that I can remember being truly and deeply creeped out happened in 2009, while I was staying at my parents' house during a break from college. What makes the experience stand out to me is that it did not happen in the middle of the night. It was not dark. There was no storm. I was not alone in some abandoned building or walking through the woods. It happened in the middle of a bright, sunny afternoon. That somehow made the whole thing even stranger. By that point, I had already moved away from home to attend college. The year after I left, my parents moved into a different house. It was quite a bit larger than the place where we had lived before. The house had 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a 2-car garage. There was nothing obviously wrong with it. It was a normal family home. Still, from the first few times I visited, something about the place made me uncomfortable. I could never explain exactly why. Maybe it was simply because it did not feel like home to me. My parents had moved there after I had already gone away to school, so unlike the house where I had grown up, I had no real memories connected to it. My old home had always felt familiar. I knew every sound it made. I knew which floors creaked. I knew how the pipes sounded. I knew what the heating system did in the middle of the night. I knew the way light came through the windows. This new house was different. It belonged to my parents, but it never really felt like my house. Every time I stayed there, I felt slightly like a guest. There was also something about the size of the place that made it feel empty when only one person was home. The downstairs had the living room and the other main areas of the house, while the bedrooms were upstairs. When my parents were both at work, the house could become extremely quiet. Still, I never had any real reason to believe there was anything strange about it. I just thought it was a little creepy. That was all. During one of my college breaks in 2009, I went to stay with my parents. One day, both of them were at work, and I was home by myself. It was around 1 in the afternoon. Outside, the sun was shining brightly. This was not the kind of day when you expect anything frightening to happen. I had nothing important to do, So I was relaxing downstairs in the living room. At some point, I stretched out on the couch and fell asleep. I have always been a fairly heavy sleeper. Once I am asleep, small noises usually do not wake me. Someone can walk around, a television can be playing, doors can open and close. Usually, I sleep through it. That is why I immediately noticed something was unusual when a sound from upstairs woke me. It was the sound of a doorknob moving. More specifically, it sounded like someone was trying to open a locked door. The knob was jiggling. At first, I stayed lying on the couch. I was still half asleep, trying to understand what I had heard. Then I heard it again. The bedrooms and bathrooms upstairs had a particular type of doorknob. To lock them, you pushed part of the knob inward and turned it. My dad had not been familiar with that style when they first moved into the house. Because of that, he had accidentally locked himself inside the bathroom a few times. It had become something of a family joke. He would go into the bathroom, somehow lock the door without realizing exactly what he had done, and then become frustrated trying to get out. The rest of us found it much funnier than he did. So when I woke up and heard what sounded like someone struggling with a locked doorknob upstairs, my first thought was my dad. I figured he had come home from work for some reason. His job was only about a 10-minute drive away. Maybe he had come home during a break. Maybe he needed to pick something up. Maybe he had used the bathroom and managed to lock himself inside again. It would have been completely in character. I sat up. The house seemed quiet except for the sound upstairs. I called out something along the lines of, "I'll get you out." I do not remember my exact words, but I remember assuming it was my father and heading toward the stairs. I was not scared. Not yet. I was mostly amused. I imagined walking upstairs and finding my dad trapped behind the bathroom door again, annoyed at the stupid lock. I climbed the stairs. As I reached the second floor, I expected to see one closed door. Instead, I stopped. Every door was open. The bedroom doors were open. The bathroom doors were open. Nothing was locked. There was no one upstairs. I stood there for a moment looking around. The hallway was empty. Sunlight came through the windows. There was no person waiting for me. No sign that my father had been home. I checked the rooms. Nothing. The bathrooms were empty. The bedrooms were empty. I looked at the doors again. All of them were wide open. That was when I started feeling uncomfortable. The sound had been clear enough to wake me from sleep. I had heard a doorknob being moved. I was sure of it. But there was no locked door. There was not even a closed door. I listened. Nothing. The entire upstairs was silent. For a few seconds, I stood there trying to explain it. Maybe I had dreamed the sound. That seemed possible. I had been asleep. Sometimes a noise from a dream can seem incredibly real as you are waking up. Maybe I had dreamed about my dad locking himself in the bathroom because it had happened before. Maybe the sound had never actually occurred. Or maybe something downstairs, outside, or in the walls had made a noise that my half-asleep brain interpreted as a doorknob. There were plenty of normal explanations. So I decided not to make a big deal out of it. I went back downstairs. I returned to the living room and turned on the television. Having the TV on made the house feel less empty. There was background noise, voices, music, something familiar. The strange sound upstairs already seemed less important. I stretched out on the couch again. Since I was still tired, I fell asleep almost immediately. I do not know exactly how long I slept the second time. Probably not very long. Then I woke up again. This time, there was absolutely no question about what had woken me. The doorknob upstairs was moving again, but now it was much louder. Someone, or something, was violently jiggling it. The noise was strong enough to be heard clearly over the television. That detail is important to me. The first time, I could convince myself I had been dreaming. The house had been quiet. I had been asleep. Maybe my mind created the noise. The second time, the television was on. It was producing constant background sound, yet the noise upstairs was loud enough to cut through it. I opened my eyes. Immediately, I was wide awake. The sound continued. A doorknob being shaken, hard, fast, like someone was desperately trying to open a locked door. I stayed completely still on the couch. My heart started beating faster. The entire mood of the house changed in an instant. Outside, it was still sunny. It was probably around 2 in the afternoon by then. Nothing about the time of day should have been frightening. But suddenly, I felt completely alone. I reached for my cell phone. The first thing I wanted to do was find out whether one of my parents had come home without me noticing. Maybe my dad really was upstairs. Maybe he had entered while I was asleep. Maybe the first sound had been a dream, but the second one was actually him. I called him. He answered. He was still at work. That immediately made me more nervous. I asked whether he had been home. No, he had not. He was at work and had been there the entire time. Then I called my mother. Maybe she had come home early. Maybe I had somehow missed her arriving. She answered too. She was also still at work. Neither of my parents was home. I was alone. I sat there holding my phone. The television was still playing. I turned it off. Suddenly, the house became completely silent. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No more movement from upstairs. Just silence. For a moment, I thought about going back up. Part of me wanted an explanation. I had already checked once. Everything had been empty. If I went up again, maybe I would find something obvious. A loose doorknob. A window causing pressure changes. Something vibrating. Maybe a door had swung closed while I was asleep. Maybe there was some simple mechanical explanation. I sat there considering it. Then another part of my brain gave me a much simpler answer. No, absolutely not. I had already gone upstairs once after hearing the sound. There had been no one there. Every door had been open. Then I had come downstairs and gone back to sleep. Now the same sound had returned, louder and more violent than before. Both of my parents had confirmed they were still at work. Whatever was causing that noise, I did not need to investigate it. I got up. I left the house. I did not walk upstairs. I did not check every room. I did not call out asking if anyone was there. I did not try to prove to myself that I was being ridiculous. I simply got out. To this day, I think that was the right decision. Maybe there was a completely normal explanation. In fact, there probably was. But if there was, I never found out what it was. What bothers me most is how clear the sound was. I know what a doorknob sounds like when someone is trying to turn it. This was not wood creaking. It was not plumbing. It was not the heating or cooling system. It sounded exactly like a person gripping a knob and violently trying to open a door that would not move. The first time, I heard it well enough to immediately think of my father accidentally locking himself in the bathroom. That association did not come from nowhere. The sound was familiar. I knew exactly what it reminded me of. But when I checked, no doors were locked. None were even closed. That is the detail I still cannot make sense of. Suppose a door had been closed, then maybe the lock was defective. Maybe the knob was moving because of some strange pressure inside the house. But every door upstairs had been open when I checked. If the sound came from a doorknob, which one was it? And who was touching it? The second time was worse because I was more awake. The television was running. I was no longer in that confused state between sleeping and waking. Yet the noise came back. Louder, more aggressive. That is why I could no longer dismiss it as a dream. I have wondered whether someone could have been inside the house. That explanation is actually more frightening than anything supernatural. Maybe an intruder had entered. Maybe they were hiding upstairs. But that possibility creates its own problems. I had gone upstairs after the first sound. I looked through the area. I did not see anyone. All the doors were open. If someone had been hiding, where were they? I suppose they could have been inside a closet, under a bed. Somewhere I did not carefully search. I was not expecting an intruder, so I did not check every possible hiding place. Maybe someone had been upstairs the entire time. That thought is unpleasant. But if there really had been an intruder, why would they violently shake a doorknob and make enough noise to wake me? Why not stay quiet? Why announce their presence? And why did nothing appear to be missing afterward? As far as I know, my parents never found evidence that anyone had broken in. There were no damaged windows, no open doors, no stolen property. Nothing. Another possibility is that the sound came from outside. Maybe someone was trying another door somewhere else on the house, and the sound traveled strangely. But I remember it clearly as coming from upstairs. The direction seemed obvious. Both times I was convinced the noise was above me. Maybe acoustics can be misleading. That happens. A sound from one part of a building can sometimes seem like it is coming from another. Still, that does not explain what actually made it. Maybe an animal was involved. A squirrel in the attic. A bird. Something inside the walls. Animals can create surprisingly human-sounding noises. A scratching animal near a door or pipe could possibly sound like a moving knob. Again, that is reasonable. But at the time, the sound was so specific that I never thought animal. I thought someone is locked in a room. Immediately, the house itself had always made me uneasy. Maybe that influenced everything. Perhaps because I already thought the place was creepy. My brain took an ordinary noise and turned it into something threatening. That is completely possible. Fear changes perception. When you are uncomfortable in a place, you notice every small sound. You interpret things differently. But before that day, I had never experienced anything truly unexplained there. I simply did not like the feeling of the house. It was large, unfamiliar, quiet. Maybe that was all. Then this happened. Afterward, my opinion of the place changed. I could no longer walk through the upstairs hallway without thinking about that sound. I would look at the open doors and remember standing there the first time. I would remember expecting to find my father trapped in the bathroom. Then, seeing nothing. I would remember going downstairs and deciding I had imagined it. Then, waking again. The second sound. Violent, loud, real enough to cut through the television. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had gone upstairs the second time. That thought bothers me more than anything. Maybe absolutely nothing. Maybe I would have found the same empty hallway. Maybe I would have laughed at myself. Maybe I would have discovered a loose doorknob vibrating for some strange reason. That would have solved the mystery. But I did not go. And because I did not go, part of my mind is free to imagine anything. What if this time one of the doors had been closed? What if I reached the top of the stairs and saw a locked door shaking in its frame? What if the knob was still moving? Would I have opened it? Probably not. What if I had reached the hallway and found every door open again? Honestly, that might have been even worse. At least a closed door would have given me a location for the sound. An empty hallway with open doors would mean the noise had no obvious source at all. I am glad I did not check. Curiosity is not always worth it. People joke about characters in horror movies making stupid decisions. They hear something upstairs and immediately go investigate. They walk into dark rooms. They open doors. They call out, "Hello?" Then something terrible happens. That afternoon, I decided not to be that person. Both of my parents were at work. I was alone. I had heard an unexplained sound twice. That was enough. I left. The strange thing is how much safer I felt the moment I stepped outside. The sun was still shining. Cars were moving somewhere in the distance. The world looked completely normal. Nothing followed me out. There was no dark figure in an upstairs window. No door slammed behind me. Nothing dramatic happened. The house simply sat there, quiet, looking like an ordinary suburban home in the middle of the afternoon. That almost made the experience stranger. Everything looked normal. I started questioning myself immediately. Had I overreacted? Maybe, but I knew what I heard. Over the years, I have tried to remember whether my parents ever experienced anything strange in that house. Nothing specific comes to mind. Maybe they did. Maybe they did not. As far as I know, there was never some long history of paranormal activity. No one told me the house was haunted. There were no stories about previous owners. Nothing like that. This was simply one unexplained event. Maybe that is why it stayed with me. If dozens of strange things had happened, I could place it into some larger story. Instead, it stands alone. One sunny afternoon, one empty house, one sound upstairs, then the same sound again. I also think about the fact that I am a heavy sleeper. The first noise had to be loud enough to wake me. That means it probably was not some tiny movement. I did not wake because a piece of wood quietly shifted. At least, I do not think so. Something got my attention strongly enough that I woke, understood the sound as a doorknob, and immediately got up to help my father. The second time, I know it was louder. It sounded violent. Someone trying hard to turn the knob. That is how I remember it. Maybe memory has exaggerated it. This happened in 2009. Years have passed. Human memory changes. I am willing to admit that. But the emotional reaction has never changed. The first time, I was confused. The second time, I was terrified. Not movie scared, not enjoying a haunted house scared. It was the kind of fear where your body tells you not to go somewhere. The kind where logic becomes secondary. My logical mind said I should check. My instincts said leave. I listened to my instincts. What makes the whole story almost funny is the time of day. It was around 1 or 2 on a Saturday afternoon. Bright sunlight. Probably one of the least frightening settings imaginable. If this had happened at 3 in the morning, everyone would understand why I was scared. But there is something uniquely disturbing about feeling threatened in broad daylight. Nighttime gives you an excuse. Everything looks strange in darkness. Shadows move. Your imagination becomes active. But daylight is supposed to make things safe. You can see. The world is awake. People are at work. Traffic is moving. There should not be anything mysterious happening upstairs in an empty house. And yet, that is the one time in my life when I remember feeling truly creeped out. I have been in dark places. I have heard strange sounds at night. I have watched scary movies alone. None of that affected me the same way. Because this happened when I was not expecting fear. I was just taking a nap. Then I heard someone trying to get out of a room upstairs. Except there was no one there. No locked door. No closed door. Nothing, the first time. I gave the house the benefit of the doubt. I decided I had dreamed it. The house apparently decided to give me a second performance. After that, I was finished. I still do not know what made the sound. Maybe I never will. Could have been the house settling. Could have been an animal. Could have been some strange mechanical problem. Could have been something outside. Could have been a dream the first time and coincidence the second. All of those explanations are possible. I prefer them. But none of them completely fit the way I remember the experience. What I remember is waking from a deep sleep because someone upstairs was jiggling a locked doorknob. I remember walking up there, expecting to rescue my father from the bathroom. I remember finding every door wide open. I remember laughing it off and going back downstairs. Then, I remember waking again to the same sound, only this time much more violent. I remember turning off the television, calling my father, calling my mother, hearing both of them tell me they were still at work, then sitting in complete silence and staring toward the stairs, thinking about going up, thinking about what I might find, then deciding that whatever was happening upstairs could continue without me. I got out of the house. And honestly, I have never regretted that decision. Maybe there was nothing waiting for me. Maybe the upstairs was completely empty. But sometimes, even years later, I think about those doors. All of them wide open. And I still wonder exactly which doorknob I heard someone trying so desperately to turn. 6 years ago, when I was 19 years old, I had an experience that still bothers me whenever I think about it. I have never been able to decide whether I actually saw something supernatural or whether my mind somehow created the entire thing while I was half asleep. I have considered both possibilities many times. Maybe I saw a ghost. Maybe I had some kind of waking dream. Maybe I was caught between sleeping and being awake, and my brain placed an image into the room that was never really there. I honestly do not know. What I do know is that in that moment, it felt completely real. And regardless of what the explanation was, it remains one of the scariest things I have ever experienced. At the time, I was spending the night at the house of my two best friends. We were extremely close, and staying over at each other's homes was normal. There was nothing unusual about that particular night. We were not talking about ghosts or scary stories. We had not watched some terrifying movie that might have put strange images into my head. It was simply a normal night with friends. Eventually, it became late, and all three of us decided to go to sleep. We were sharing the same bed. I do not remember exactly what time we fell asleep, but at some point during the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. I do not remember hearing a noise. I do not remember having a nightmare. There was no obvious reason for me to wake. I simply opened my eyes. For the first few seconds, I was still tired and confused, the way anyone is when they suddenly wake in the middle of the night. The room was dark. My friends were still asleep beside me. Everything seemed quiet. Then, I looked toward the foot of the bed. There was a little girl standing there. I froze. She looked around 6 or 7 years old. She was just standing at the end of the bed, looking at us. I cannot remember every small detail about her appearance now. Years have passed, and some parts of the memory have faded. But I remember the shape of her clearly enough. A child. A young girl. Standing in the bedroom in the middle of the night, watching us sleep. My first reaction was confusion. For a brief moment, my brain tried to find a normal explanation. Maybe one of my friends had a younger relative staying in the house. Maybe someone's little sister had come into the room. But I knew that did not make sense. There was not supposed to be a child standing there. There was no reason for a little girl to be inside the room at that hour. And even if there had been a child in the house, there was something strange about the way this girl stood. She was completely silent. She did not speak. She did not move toward us. She did not ask for help. She simply stared. I was terrified, completely terrified. People often imagine that if they ever saw something they believed was a ghost, they would scream or jump out of bed. Maybe they would wake everyone else. Maybe they would run. That was not what happened to me. I could not do anything. I was too scared. My body felt frozen. All I could do was stare back at her. I remember thinking that I should wake my friends. They were right beside me. I could have touched one of them. I could have said their name. I could have shaken them awake. But I did not. The fear was too strong. Part of me was afraid that if I moved, the girl would react. Maybe she would come closer. Maybe she would disappear. Maybe something worse would happen. So I stayed completely still. I watched her. And she watched us. I have no idea how long that moment lasted. It could have been only a few seconds. It could have been longer. Fear does strange things to your sense of time. When you are terrified, a short moment can feel endless. I kept staring at the girl because I was almost afraid to look away. I thought that if I closed my eyes and opened them again, she might suddenly be standing closer. Or maybe she would be gone, and I would spend the rest of the night wondering whether she had really been there. So I kept looking. Then something happened that made the experience even stranger. The little girl began to fade. She did not suddenly disappear. She slowly became less visible. I watched as the shape of her seemed to grow lighter and less solid. Then, gradually, she was gone. The foot of the bed was empty again. I remained where I was. I was still too frightened to move. My friends continued sleeping as though nothing had happened. The room returned to complete silence. I remember staring at the spot where the girl had been. Nothing was there, no child, no shadow that looked like a person, no object that I could have mistaken for her. Just the room. I did not know what to do. Part of me wanted to wake my friends and tell them immediately. But what would I say? There was a little girl standing at the foot of the bed, but she disappeared? Even to me, it sounded unbelievable. I had been asleep only moments earlier. Maybe I had dreamed it. That thought became the explanation I tried to hold on to. Maybe I had not been completely awake. There are strange experiences people can have when waking from sleep. Sometimes you can dream while feeling awake. Sometimes you can see things in the room that are not actually there. At 19, I did not know much about sleep hallucinations or anything like that, but I knew that dreams could feel real. Maybe that was what happened. Maybe the little girl had only existed in my mind. I tried to convince myself of that. Eventually, I must have gone back to sleep. The next morning, I did not tell my friends what I had seen. I thought about telling them. More than once. But I could not bring myself to do it. I was afraid they would laugh. I was afraid they would think I was making it up. More than that, I was not even sure I believed myself. How could I expect them to believe something I could barely accept? For the next several days, I kept thinking about the girl. The memory would suddenly return when I was doing completely normal things. I would remember waking up. I would remember looking down. I would see her standing there again in my mind. A little girl around 6 or 7 years old. Quiet, still, watching us, then slowly fading. The part that bothered me was how real the room had felt. It did not feel like a normal dream. I knew where I was. I could see my friends beside me. I recognized the bedroom. Everything around the girl seemed completely normal. Only she did not belong there. Still, I said nothing. Days became weeks. Then, weeks became months. I kept the experience to myself. I never told my friends. Every once in a while, I considered bringing it up, but I always stopped myself. I thought they definitely would not believe me. Maybe they would become uncomfortable sleeping in their own room. Maybe they would think I had been drunk or half asleep. So I kept quiet. Then, a few months after the night I saw the little girl, something happened to my friends. I was talking to them one day when they began telling me about a strange experience they had recently had inside their house. The moment they started describing it, I felt uncomfortable. According to them, they had been in their bedroom one night. Everything was normal. Then they heard a sound coming from the living room. Children were laughing. Not one adult. Not a television. Children, they could clearly hear what sounded like young children laughing somewhere outside their bedroom. That was strange enough on its own. There were not supposed to be children in the house. They listened for a moment. The laughter continued. They became nervous. At first, I imagine they tried to think of explanations just like I had. Maybe the television was on. Maybe the sound came from outside. Maybe neighbors were making noise. But it sounded like the laughter was coming from inside the house, from the living room. So they decided to investigate. They got up and moved toward their bedroom door. They did not immediately open it. Instead, they went closer because they wanted to listen more carefully. They wanted to figure out exactly where the sound was coming from. The moment they reached the door, something hit it. Hard, a loud thunk. It sounded like someone or something had struck the other side. That was enough for them. They became convinced there might actually be someone inside the house. They opened the door and ran out of the bedroom. They searched. No one was there. The living room was empty. The rest of the house was empty. They checked the doors. Everything was still locked. There was no sign that anyone had broken in. No open window. No person hiding somewhere. Nothing that explained the laughter. Nothing that explained the impact against the bedroom door. When they finished telling me what had happened, I just sat there. All I could think about was the little girl. For months, I had convinced myself that my experience had probably been a dream, a strange hallucination. Something created by my brain because I had woken up too quickly. But now my friends were telling me that they had heard children laughing inside the same house. Children, that word stayed in my head. Not random voices, not footsteps, children laughing. And then something had hit their bedroom door. That was when I finally told them. I told them about the night I stayed at their house. I told them that I had woken up in the middle of the night and seen a little girl standing at the foot of the bed. I explained that she looked around 6 or 7 years old. I told them how she had been watching us, how I had been too frightened to move, how I had stared at her, and how she had slowly faded away. I told them I had kept the story to myself for months because I did not believe they would take me seriously. Their experience made me feel like I could finally say it. I do not remember exactly how they reacted. I imagine they were frightened. I know that if I had lived in that house and someone told me they had seen a child in my bedroom months before I heard unexplained children laughing in the living room, I would have been disturbed. The two stories seemed connected. Maybe they were not. Maybe that is simply the way our minds work. Once we hear two strange things involving children, we automatically put them together. But the connection was difficult to ignore. A little girl appears in the bedroom. Months later, children's laughter comes from the living room. Then, something strikes the bedroom door. No one is found. The doors are still locked. I started thinking more seriously about what I had seen. Could it really have been a ghost? I had never been completely sure I believed in ghosts. Even after that night, I remained uncertain. I still am. There are reasonable explanations for what happened to me. The strongest one is that I experienced some kind of sleep hallucination. Maybe I woke up while part of my brain was still dreaming. That would explain why the girl appeared so real. It might even explain why she slowly faded away instead of disappearing suddenly. Maybe as I became fully awake, the dream image slowly disappeared. That actually makes a lot of sense. The human brain can do strange things around sleep. People see figures, hear voices, feel someone touching them. Sometimes they are completely convinced there is another person in the room. Maybe I experienced something like that. I would almost prefer that explanation. It is much more comforting than believing a dead child was standing beside the bed watching us. But then there is what happened to my friends. Their experience is harder for me to explain because both of them were apparently awake. They both heard the laughter. They both heard or felt something strike the door. They both searched the house. Maybe there was an ordinary explanation. A sound from outside could have traveled strangely through the house. The laughter could have come from a television somewhere. The impact on the door might have been caused by something falling. Maybe an air pressure change moved the door. Maybe an animal was somewhere outside. There are possibilities. But when you combine their story with mine, things become uncomfortable. I have wondered whether the house had any history connected to children. I never asked. Part of me wanted to know. Another part did not. What if a little girl had died there? What if something terrible had happened in the house? Would that make the experience more believable? Or would it only make me more afraid? Sometimes knowing the history of a place makes everything worse. Maybe there is no history at all. Maybe the house was completely normal. Maybe no child had ever died there. Maybe my experience and theirs were unrelated coincidences. That is entirely possible. Still, I cannot forget how the girl looked. There is something especially frightening about seeing a child where no child should be. An adult figure might have made me think someone had broken into the house. That would have been terrifying in a different way. But a little girl standing silently at the foot of the bed created a different kind of fear. She did not seem aggressive. She did not threaten me. She did not reach toward us. But her presence felt wrong. She was not supposed to be there. Why was she watching us? Did she know we could see her? Was she trying to communicate? Or was she simply standing there? Maybe she had been there many times before and no one had noticed. That thought bothers me. What if she had stood beside the bed on other nights? What if she watched my friends while they slept? What if the only reason I saw her was because I happened to wake at the right moment? Again, these are only thoughts. I do not know whether she was real. But once you start thinking about possibilities like that, it becomes difficult to stop. The fact that I never saw her again makes the experience even stranger. I have never had another moment exactly like it. I have never regularly seen ghosts. I do not have a history of hallucinations. I do not wake every night seeing people who are not there. It happened once, one night, one little girl. That is all. Maybe that supports the idea that it was a dream. Maybe my brain simply created a particularly realistic image one time. But if that is the case, the timing of my friend's experience was an unfortunate coincidence. They could have told me about any strange event. Footsteps, lights turning on, objects moving. Instead, they told me about children. That was what finally pushed me to tell them. I think about the sound they described sometimes. Children laughing in an empty living room. Normally, children's laughter is a happy sound. It means someone is playing, having fun. But context changes everything. At night, inside a locked house where no children are present, that same sound becomes terrifying. Imagine lying in bed and hearing it. You know who is supposed to be in the house. You know no kids are there, but you can hear them anyway. Then you approach the door, and something hits it from the other side. I am not sure what I would have done. My friends were brave enough to run out and search the house. I probably would have locked the bedroom door and stayed there until morning. Maybe they expected to catch an intruder. Maybe they thought someone had broken in and was playing a joke, but they found nothing. The locked doors are another detail that bothered me. If someone had been inside, how did they get there? And where did they go? Of course, maybe no one was ever there. Maybe the entire event was caused by ordinary sounds. But to my friends, it was real enough to make them search the house, just like the girl had been real enough to make me stare at her in terror. I have talked myself through the possibilities many times. Ghost, dream, sleep hallucination. Coincidence, unexplained noise. The answer changes depending on my mood. Some days, I am completely convinced I was half asleep. It is the logical explanation. I woke suddenly. My brain was not fully awake. I saw an image. It faded. Simple other times, especially when I remember my friends describing the children laughing, I wonder. Maybe I really did see something. Maybe the little girl had some connection to the house. Maybe the laughter they heard months later was connected to her. Maybe she was not alone. There was more than one child's voice, according to their story. Did that mean there were other children, or was the sound simply impossible to identify clearly? There are too many questions, no answers. I also think about why the girl appeared at the foot of the bed. Why there? Why was she looking at us? If it was a dream, then perhaps my brain chose that location because it was where I naturally looked when I woke up. If it was something else, I have no explanation. Maybe she was curious. Maybe she had once slept in that room. Maybe she was looking for someone. Maybe none of those ideas are true. The most vivid part of the memory is still the helplessness. I wanted to move. I could not. I wanted to wake my friends. I did not. I simply stared. People sometimes describe ghost sightings as exciting. They say they would love to see proof. They want to stay in haunted hotels or visit old buildings at night. I understand the curiosity. But when something appears unexpectedly in the room where you are sleeping, curiosity is not the first emotion you feel. Fear is. At least, it was for me. I did not think, this is amazing. I might be seeing a ghost. I thought, there is a little girl standing at the end of this bed, and I do not know how she got here. That was terrifying enough. Then she faded. Maybe that should have made me feel safer. Instead, it made everything worse. If she had turned around and walked out of the room, I could have believed she was a real child. If she had opened the door, I could have followed her. But people do not slowly disappear. That was the moment when the normal explanations became harder. Even if I had been mistaken about who she was, how could I mistake someone leaving for someone fading away? Unless, of course, I was dreaming. That brings me back to the same place every time. I do not know. Maybe I will never know. I am okay with that most of the time. The experience happened 6 years ago. Life moved on. My friends and I continued with our lives. As far as I know, nothing terrible happened because of the girl. She never hurt anyone. The strange sounds did not become some constant nightmare. There was no dramatic ending, just a few unexplained moments. Still, when people ask me about the scariest thing I have ever experienced, that night is one of the first memories that comes back. I remember waking. I remember the dark room. I remember my two friends sleeping beside me. Then I remember looking toward the foot of the bed. She was already there, a little girl, 6 or 7 years old, standing completely still, watching us. I remember being too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. I remember staring at her because I did not know what else to do. And I remember watching her slowly disappear. For months, I said nothing. because I thought nobody would believe me. I was not even sure I believed myself. Then my friends told me they had heard children laughing inside their locked house. They had walked to their bedroom door to listen. Something had struck the other side with a loud bang. They searched everywhere. No one was there. Only then did I finally tell them what I had seen. Maybe my experience was only a dream. Maybe theirs was only a collection of strange sounds. Maybe combining the two stories makes them seem more mysterious than they really are. That is probably the explanation a skeptic would give. And maybe the skeptic would be right. But even if I was dreaming, my fear that night was real. I can still remember the feeling in my chest. I can still remember being afraid that if I moved, the girl might do something. I can still remember the way she seemed to slowly disappear in front of me. And whenever I think about my friends standing at their bedroom door months later, listening to children laughing in an empty house, I cannot help wondering whether I really had been dreaming after all. Maybe there was never a little girl. Maybe there was. I just know that for one night, when I was 19 years old, I woke up and saw a child standing silently at the foot of the bed. And months later, my friends heard children who were not there. A few years ago, I was staying with my sister for a while because she and her significant other were going through a rough period in their relationship. They had been fighting a lot, and things had become uncomfortable enough that he decided to stay somewhere else for a while. My sister did not really want to be alone in the house, so she asked if I could stay with her. I did not mind. Honestly, there were worse situations to be in. I had somewhere comfortable to sleep, my sister felt safer having someone there, and I got free internet out of the deal. So, for a while, I stayed at her place. Most nights were completely normal. Nothing strange happened. Nothing made me think the house was haunted or that there was anything unusual about the place. I was simply there because my sister did not want to spend every night alone while things between her and her partner were uncertain. I usually slept in the living room. There were 2 couches in the room. The couch I slept on was near a window. Behind me, along another wall closer to the front door, there was a second couch. The layout meant that when I was lying down, the other couch was basically behind me. If I sat up and turned around, I could see it. It was a simple setup. At night, the living room was fairly dark, but not completely black. There was enough light coming through the window and from around the house that once my eyes adjusted, I could make out the furniture. I could see the shapes of the couches, the walls, the doorway. Nothing in the room was completely hidden. That detail matters because of what happened one night. I had fallen asleep on the couch like I normally did. Sometime in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. I came awake hard, not slowly. I practically jumped awake. It felt like I had been pulled out of a nightmare. My heart was already beating fast, and I had that strange feeling you get after a really bad dream, when your body is still reacting even though your mind cannot remember exactly what scared you. The strange part was that I could not remember the dream, not even a little bit. I knew I had been having a nightmare. I could feel it. But the details were gone. No images, no story, nothing, just fear. I sat up on the couch and looked around the living room. For a moment, I was still trying to understand where I was. Then my eyes adjusted. The room was dark, but I could see well enough. The window, the walls, the furniture. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I slowly looked around. Then my eyes reached the couch behind me. I froze. There was someone sitting on it. At least, that was what it looked like. A tall, dark figure was sitting on the couch near the front door. The second I saw it, I jumped up. My body reacted before my brain had time to understand what I was looking at. I stood there, staring. My first thought was not ghost. It was not demon. It was not hallucination. My first thought was that someone had broken into the house. A stranger was sitting in my sister's living room. And because my sister was somewhere else in the house, probably asleep, my immediate instinct was to protect her. I am her brother. Whatever was going on between her and her partner at the time, I had agreed to stay there because she did not want to be alone. Now, there was apparently some unknown person sitting in the living room in the middle of the night. My first instinct was to rush him, just run straight at him, attack before he had a chance to do anything. Maybe that was stupid. Maybe it was brave, probably a little of both. But I did not move immediately. I stood there, staring, and the longer I looked, the stranger the figure became. At first, I thought I was looking at a man dressed in dark clothing. But as my eyes adjusted, I started seeing more details. The figure was tall. It was wearing what looked like a long black robe. The robe had a pointed hood, not a normal sweatshirt hood. It looked long and sharp at the top, almost ceremonial. The robe seemed to cover the entire body. The figure's head was lowered. The hood hung forward enough that I could not see the face inside. I could not see eyes, I could not see skin, I could not see any features at all. Only darkness inside the hood. Its arms were crossed in front of its body, or maybe folded into the robe. It was difficult to tell exactly, but the arms seemed to be folded across each other, almost completely hidden by the long sleeves or dark fabric. The figure did not move. That was what frightened me most. It was not reacting to me. I had jumped up. I was standing there looking directly at it. Any normal person would have responded. They would look up. They would move. They would say something. They would run. This thing just sat there. Still, silent, head lowered. I stared. The entire experience probably lasted only a few seconds, maybe less. But it felt much longer. Time seemed to stretch. Every part of my mind was trying to understand what I was seeing. Was it a person? Was it someone wearing a costume? Had my sister's partner come back? Had someone broken in? Was I still dreaming? None of those explanations made sense. The figure looked too strange, too dark, too still. I could feel fear building inside me, not normal fear, the kind that makes your skin tighten, the kind that sends a chill down your back. Even now, thinking about it brings back that feeling. I remember staring at the hood and knowing there was supposed to be a face inside. But I could not see one. That empty darkness was horrible. Part of me wanted to charge it. Another part wanted to run. Eventually, the second instinct won. I turned and ran into the next room. I needed something I could use as a weapon. Anything, something heavy. Something I could throw. Something I could swing. I searched quickly. I do not know what I expected to find. A bat would have been nice. A metal bar. A chair. Anything useful. Instead, I found a basketball. A basketball. That was the weapon I ended up with. Looking back, the whole thing sounds ridiculous. A terrifying hooded figure is sitting in the living room, and my best defense is a basketball. But at the time, I grabbed it and held onto it as tightly as I could. Maybe I thought I could throw it at the figure. Maybe I thought I could use it as some kind of shield. I do not know. I just needed something in my hands. I stood in the next room, clutching the basketball. I was breathing hard. My heart was pounding. I tried to think. That was when I started questioning everything. Had I really been awake? Maybe I had not. Maybe I was still halfway inside the nightmare. I had woken suddenly. I had been frightened before I even opened my eyes. Maybe my brain had continued the dream after I woke. That made sense. People see strange things when they are waking from sleep. Maybe the figure had never been there. Maybe I had experienced some kind of sleep hallucination. I stood there for a while, forcing myself to wake up fully. I blinked. I looked around. I moved. I focused on the room. At that point, I was completely awake. No doubt about it. The strange fog of sleep was gone. I could think clearly. That made me feel a little better. I tried to find another explanation. Maybe it was a pile of clothes. Yes, that had to be it. A pile of clothes sitting on the couch. Maybe a coat had been thrown over something. Maybe there was a blanket piled up. Maybe shadows from the window made the clothes look like a tall person in a robe. That could happen. In a dark room, ordinary objects can look terrifying. Everyone has had that experience. You wake up and think someone is standing in the corner. Then you turn on the light and realize it is just a jacket hanging over a chair. Maybe that was all this was. The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself. It was clothes, nothing more. I had just woken from a nightmare. My mind was already frightened. I looked at a pile of clothing on the couch and turned it into a person. Simple, normal, no reason to panic. I held on to that explanation. But there was one problem. I still had to go back into the living room. I did not want to. I stayed in the next room for a while, holding the basketball like an idiot and trying to build up enough courage to return. I knew that if it was really just a pile of clothes, I would feel stupid. That was fine. I wanted to feel stupid. Feeling stupid was much better than finding out there really was something sitting there. Eventually, I decided I had to look. I could not stand in the other room all night holding a basketball. So I slowly walked back toward the living room. I moved carefully. Every part of me expected the figure to still be there. I reached the doorway. I looked toward the couch. The room was still dark. I could not immediately see clearly enough. So I reached for the light. I turned it on. The room filled with light. I looked directly at the couch. Nothing, the figure was gone. There was no one sitting there. No person. No hooded robe. No stranger. Nothing. For a moment I felt relieved. Then I remembered my explanation. The clothes. I looked at the couch again. There were no clothes. No blankets. No coat. Nothing piled up. There was not a single object sitting in the place where I had seen the figure. Nothing even remotely shaped like a person. The couch was empty. I walked closer. I looked around. Maybe something had fallen onto the floor. No, nothing. Maybe a jacket had slipped behind the couch. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing there that could have created the shape I saw. That was when the fear returned. I stood there, staring at the empty couch. I tried to recreate the image in my head. The tall shape, the pointed hood, the dark robe, the folded arms, the lowered head. It had been so clear, too clear. How could I have seen all of that if there had been nothing there? I considered waking my sister. I did not. I do not know why. Maybe I did not want to scare her. She was already dealing with enough stress. She had asked me to stay because she did not want to be alone. The last thing she needed was me waking her up in the middle of the night and telling her that I had just seen some kind of hooded figure sitting near the front door. Maybe I was embarrassed. What if she laughed? What if she told me I had been dreaming? Honestly, that was still possible. I had woken suddenly from a nightmare. Maybe my brain had created the image. Maybe the reason there was nothing on the couch was because there had never been anything there. That was the explanation I tried to accept. I turned off the light. Eventually, I went back to the couch where I had been sleeping. Yes, somehow I actually went back to sleep. I do not know how. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe I convinced myself strongly enough that it had been a dream. I lay back down. But I remember being much more aware of the room after that. I kept thinking about the couch behind me. I did not want to turn around. Part of me expected that if I looked again, the figure would be back, sitting in the same position. Head lowered. Waiting, I eventually fell asleep. The next morning came. Everything was normal. The living room looked completely ordinary in daylight. The couch was empty. There were no signs that anyone had broken into the house. The front door was secure. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been moved. There was no evidence that a stranger had ever been inside. I said nothing. I never told my sister. I never told anyone else. I kept the experience to myself. For a long time, I tried to forget it. But every once in a while, the memory returned, usually at night. Usually when I woke unexpectedly. I would remember sitting up on that couch, looking behind me, seeing that figure. The image never changed. A tall, dark form, long black robe, pointed hood, head lowered, arms crossed. Still, silent, there is something about a hooded figure that is naturally unsettling. Maybe it is because you cannot see the face. Faces tell us what people are thinking. You can see anger, fear, confusion. A hidden face gives you nothing. You cannot tell what the person wants. You cannot tell where they are looking. You cannot tell whether they are even human. That was how I felt, staring into the darkness beneath the hood. I knew there should have been a face, but I could not see one. The figure also looked strangely formal. The robe did not resemble ordinary clothing. It looked almost ritualistic, like something someone would wear during a ceremony. Maybe that impression came from movies or stories. Maybe my mind used familiar imagery from horror films to create the hallucination. That is possible. It would explain the pointed hood, the long robe, the dramatic appearance. Maybe my brain had been dreaming about something similar before I woke. I just could not remember the dream. That is probably the most logical explanation. I had a nightmare. I woke suddenly. For a few seconds, part of the dream continued into the real room. I saw a figure that was not actually there. Then I ran into another room. By the time I became fully awake, the hallucination had disappeared. That explains everything. Almost the problem is how real it felt. People always say that about strange experiences. It felt real. Of course it did. Dreams can feel real. Hallucinations can feel real. That does not mean the thing actually existed. I know that. Still, memory does not always care about logic. When I think about that night, I do not remember something vague. I remember a figure. I remember seeing the shape clearly enough that my first instinct was to attack it. I remember standing there long enough for the details to become clearer. I remember realizing it was wearing a robe. I remember the hood. I remember the position of the arms. That is what makes it difficult to dismiss completely. If I had only seen a dark shape for half a second, I would have no problem calling it a dream. But I stood there. I looked. The figure remained, at least for those few seconds. It did not disappear the moment I blinked. It did not immediately turn into furniture. It stayed there until I ran from the room. Then, when I returned with the light on, it was gone. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had followed my first instinct. What if I had charged it? What if I had run straight across the room and tried to tackle whatever was sitting on the couch? Would I have hit the couch? Would I have fallen through empty air? Would the figure have disappeared as I got closer? Would something have happened? I am glad I did not find out. Running for a weapon was probably the smarter decision, even if that weapon turned out to be a basketball. The basketball part is almost funny now. Almost, I can imagine how ridiculous I must have looked. Standing in another room in the middle of the night, terrified, holding a basketball against my chest like it was going to protect me from some dark hooded creature. But fear does not make people logical. You grab what you can. At least it gave me something to hold. Something real. Something physical. I think That helped me calm down. I could feel the ball in my hands. I could focus on it. I could remind myself that I was awake, that the room around me was real, that whatever I had seen had probably been part of the dream. Then I checked. Nothing. I wished there had been clothes on the couch. Honestly, I wished there had been a huge pile of black laundry. A coat, a blanket, anything. I would have laughed at myself. I would have gone back to sleep with a simple explanation. Instead, the couch was completely empty. That is why the experience has stayed with me. There was no object to blame, no strange arrangement of furniture. Nothing. Maybe the explanation was entirely inside my head. That is what I believe most of the time. A waking dream. A hallucination caused by suddenly coming out of a nightmare. I know experiences like that can happen, but sometimes when I remember how it looked, I am not so sure. There is another part that bothers me. The figure was sitting near the front door. Maybe that is meaningless. It was simply where the second couch happened to be. But the position made it feel like someone had entered the house and sat down, as though it had been waiting there. It was not standing over me. It was not approaching. It was not threatening me. It was simply sitting. That almost made it worse. If it had been attacking, I would have reacted without thinking. Instead, it gave me time to look, time to understand that something was wrong, time to notice details. The head lowered, the arms folded, the absolute stillness. I still do not know what I saw. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything happened inside my own mind. That is the answer I would give if someone else told me this story. You woke up from a nightmare. You were still half asleep. Your brain created a figure. Simple, and maybe that is exactly what happened. But I also know how awake I felt when I jumped off that couch. I know how clearly I remember standing there. I know the fear. I know the details. Then I know I walked back into that room, turned on the light, and found absolutely nothing. No clothes, no blanket, no object. Nothing that looked even slightly like the thing I had seen. I went back to sleep. I told no one. And for years, the image stayed with me. Even now, whenever I wake suddenly in a dark room, there is sometimes a split second where I am afraid to look toward the nearest chair or couch. Because a small part of me remembers that night. And it still expects to see that tall black figure sitting there quietly, with its head lowered beneath that pointed hood, waiting for me to notice it again. My first night in Somalia is something I have never forgotten. At the time, we had just arrived and needed to set up a temporary camp. Everything felt unfamiliar. The landscape, the darkness, the damage from fighting, the way everyone moved with purpose, because we knew we had to secure the area quickly. We ended up using the embassy golf course as part of our camp. Calling it a golf course almost made the place sound peaceful, but there was nothing peaceful about it. The compound was surrounded by walls that had taken heavy damage. There were huge artillery holes punched through sections of them, wide enough that anyone could potentially use them as a way into the compound. There was almost no moon that night. The darkness was thick. It was the kind of darkness that makes distance difficult to judge. You could look toward the damaged walls and see almost nothing beyond them. That meant every opening had to be secured. We wired the gaps in the walls as best we could. No one wanted to leave an easy entrance for anyone who might be watching us from outside. Everything had to be done quickly. We were new to the position, and the camp needed defenses before anyone could properly rest. After the sun went down, a bulldozer was brought in to dig defensive fighting positions. The machine moved through the darkness, cutting into the ground and creating holes where men could take up positions around the perimeter. At the time, nobody thought there was anything unusual about the ground. We just needed places to defend the compound. The bulldozer dug. We set up security. Then, People began taking shifts. Sometime a little before midnight, it was my turn. I was assigned to one of the freshly dug fighting holes. My duty was going to last for a few hours. The men who had been there before us were ready to get out. When we arrived to relieve them, one of the first things they mentioned was the smell. They complained about how bad it was inside the hole. At first, I assumed they were exaggerating. Everyone complains on duty. It is too hot, too cold, too wet, too uncomfortable. The equipment is bad, the ground is terrible, the shift is too long. Complaining is normal. So when they said the hole smelled awful, I did not think much about it. Then I climbed inside. They had not been exaggerating. The smell was horrible. It was not the normal smell of disturbed earth. It was not mud. It was not sewage. It was something much worse. Heavy, rotten, the odor seemed trapped inside the fighting position. Once I was down there was no escaping it. Every breath brought it back. At first, I tried not to think about it. We had work to do. I was there to pull security, not investigate why the ground smelled bad. It was dark. We were in a recently damaged area. There could have been any number of explanations. Dead animals, trash buried underground, old sewage, rotting vegetation, something left behind by the fighting. That was what I told myself. I focused on the area outside the compound, the darkness beyond the walls, the gaps we had wired, any movement that might appear. That was where my attention needed to be. Still, the smell was impossible to completely ignore. It stayed with us for the entire shift. Then there was another problem. The ground inside the hole was uncomfortable. There were hard, sharp objects everywhere. At first, we thought they were rocks. The bulldozer had torn through the soil and left all kinds of debris behind. Some of the pieces were jagged enough that they poked us whenever we moved. You would shift your weight and feel something sharp pressing into your leg. Move again and something else would dig into your side. It was irritating, uncomfortable, but again, it did not seem mysterious. It was just a badly dug fighting hole. At least, that was what we believed. So for hours, we stayed there, in the dark, surrounded by the terrible smell, sitting and lying among those sharp pieces we thought were stones. The night moved slowly. Night duty usually does. You watch, you listen, you wait. Your mind becomes aware of every small sound, especially in a place like Somalia during your first night, when everything is unfamiliar. You do not know what noises are normal yet. You do not know the area. You do not know what is beyond the darkness. Every movement catches your attention. Every distant sound makes you look up. The damaged compound walls did not help. Those huge holes made the place feel exposed. We had wired them, but seeing them still reminded you that the area had been hit hard before we arrived. Artillery had already torn through those walls. The evidence of violence was everywhere. It was impossible to forget where we were. Still, the shift passed without anything happening. No attack, no emergency. Nothing came through the wire. Eventually, our hours were over. Someone came to relieve us. I climbed out of the fighting hole. I was probably mostly thinking about sleep. After being awake through the night, you stop caring about comfort. You just want somewhere to lie down. Because I had pulled duty for those hours, I was allowed to sleep in the next morning. I took advantage of it. I slept while other people started moving around camp. By the time I woke up, the sun was already up. The difference between the night before and the morning was dramatic. In darkness, everything had felt hidden. Now, the daylight exposed the compound, the damaged walls, the ground, the defensive positions, people moving from one place to another. It looked less mysterious, more real. I got up and went outside to wash. That was when I noticed there was a lot of activity near the fighting hole where I had spent part of the night. People were gathered around it, more than I would expect for a normal defensive position. Something was going on. At first, I did not understand. I looked toward the hole. The same hole where I had sat for hours. The same place that smelled so bad. The same place where we had been complaining about sharp rocks digging into us. Then, I learned the truth. The bulldozer had not simply dug into ordinary ground. It had dug into a graveyard, a poorly marked graveyard. The area had not been clearly identified before the defensive hole was created. The machine had cut directly through graves. The activity I saw that morning was not soldiers repairing the position. It was loved ones coming to claim human remains, families, people trying to recover pieces of the dead. Suddenly, everything from the night before made sense. The smell. It had not been sewage, not garbage, not dead animals. It was decomposition. Human decomposition. The sharp rocks that had been poking us throughout the night were not rocks. They were bone fragments, human bones. The bulldozer had torn through graves and scattered pieces throughout the fighting hole. We had spent hours sitting among them. That realization hit differently from anything I had expected. The night before, we had been focused entirely on what might be outside the compound. We were watching the darkness, watching the damaged walls, waiting for a threat. We thought danger would come toward us from somewhere beyond the wire. The entire time, we were sitting inside a grave. I remember thinking back to the men we had relieved. They had complained about the smell. We had complained about it too. None of us knew what it was. We thought the sharp pieces in the dirt were just stones. We shifted our bodies around them, probably pushed some aside, maybe leaned against them, maybe kicked them without realizing it. Now, in daylight, people were searching through that same ground for the remains of people they loved. There is something deeply disturbing about learning the truth after the fact. During the night, I was uncomfortable. The smell bothered me. The sharp objects annoyed me. But I was not afraid of the hole itself. I thought it was just dirt. Once I learned what had actually been there, the memory changed. I could no longer think of it as a simple fighting position. Now I saw it differently. The bulldozer blade cutting through the ground, breaking into graves, pulling apart places where people had been buried, mixing earth with human remains. Then us climbing down into it because we needed a defensive position. None of it had been intentional. We did not know. The graveyard was poorly marked. The hole had been dug at night. No one realized what the bulldozer was cutting through. But knowing it was an accident did not make the scene any less disturbing. The activity around the hole that morning was especially hard to watch. Those remains were not just objects in the dirt. They belonged to people, people who had families, people who had been buried there because someone cared enough to place them in a grave. Now their loved ones were trying to recover what was left after heavy machinery had disturbed everything. That stayed with me. During war, death can sometimes become distant. You hear numbers. You hear reports. You see damage, destroyed buildings, cratered roads, broken walls. But a graveyard brings death back to something personal. Every grave represents someone. Someone's father, mother, brother, sister, child, friend. That morning, the remains around the fighting position were being claimed by people who still remembered exactly who those dead had been. I also thought about the hours I had spent down there. It had been nearly moonless. I could barely see the ground. I had no idea what I was touching. That was probably a good thing. If I had known during the night that the hole had been dug through graves, I do not know how I would have felt. I still would have had to pull duty. there would not have been much choice. We needed a position. We needed security. But knowing you are sitting in a disturbed graveyard is different from finding out afterward. The darkness probably protected us from understanding what was around us. We thought we were surrounded by dirt and rock. We were surrounded by human remains. The smell should have been the first clue. Looking back, it seems obvious. But in the moment, your mind does not immediately jump to something like that. You look for normal explanations, especially when you are tired, especially when you have just arrived in a new country, especially when you are focused on security. We were thinking tactically, not emotionally. There was a bad smell. Fine, maybe something was buried there. There were sharp objects. Fine, rocks, debris the bulldozer had dug quickly. Nothing more. Then daylight came and stripped away the easy explanations. That experience taught me something about how completely different a place can look depending on what you know. Before I knew the truth, the hole was just uncomfortable. After I knew, it was horrifying. The dirt had not changed. The smell had not changed. The bone fragments had already been there. The only thing that changed was my understanding. And that was enough. Sometimes I think about the exact pieces that had been poking us. How large were they? What part of a body had they once belonged to? I try not to think about it too much. There is no point. But the thought comes back anyway. A piece we pushed aside could have been part of someone's arm. A rib. Something else. We had no way of knowing. The bulldozer had reduced everything to debris mixed with soil. That is what made the morning scene so grim. The families were not simply opening intact graves and removing bodies. They were trying to identify and recover remains from ground that had been torn apart. I cannot imagine what that must have felt like for them. Maybe anger, grief, shock, maybe all of it. From their point of view, foreigners had arrived and accidentally dug defensive positions through a burial ground. We had not done it deliberately. But that did not undo the damage. I have always remembered that part. War creates situations where terrible things happen without anyone intending them. Everyone is moving fast. Survival comes first. Information is incomplete. Maps are wrong. Markers disappear. Places that once had clear boundaries are damaged by years of conflict. A graveyard becomes difficult to identify. A bulldozer operator sees open ground. A defensive hole gets dug. Then morning comes, and families arrive. That was my first night in Somalia. Of all the things I might have expected, spending several hours inside a disturbed cemetery was not one of them. We had prepared for attacks. We had wired the holes in the walls. We had created defensive positions. We had watched the darkness carefully. But the most disturbing thing about the night was already beneath us before we arrived. I still remember the smell. At the time, it was just disgusting. Something to complain about. Now, whenever I think about it, I know exactly what it was. Decomposition, that knowledge, changes the memory. I remember breathing it in for hours, sitting there, trying to ignore it, probably joking about how bad the hole smelled. I imagine the men before us did the same thing. None of us understood. Then there were the rocks. That is the detail that bothers me most. The smell was horrible, but smell is distant in a strange way. You experience it without touching the source. The bone fragments were physical. They were under us, against us, poking through clothing. We were shifting around because they were uncomfortable. And every time I think about that, I remember how casually we treated them. Move that rock. Kick that one aside. Try to find a softer position. But they were not rocks. They were parts of people. People whose families were outside the next morning trying to collect them. The contrast between the night and the morning is what makes the whole memory so powerful. At night, everything was anonymous. Darkness, dirt, smell, sharp objects. A fighting position. By morning, everything had names, even if I did not know them. Those remains belonged to somebody. The graveyard had meaning. The people gathering around the hole had come because the dead mattered to them. It turned something I had thought of as unpleasant into something tragic. I do not remember how long the recovery process lasted. I do not remember exactly how many graves had been disturbed. Those details have faded. What remains clear is the moment I understood what I had been sitting in. There are certain realizations that happen all at once. The brain takes several unrelated details and suddenly connects them. The smell, the sharp pieces, the crowd, the remains, everything aligned. And I remember thinking something like, oh no, the men we relieved had complained about the smell. We had complained about it too. The ground was full of jagged pieces. We had assumed they were stone. Now there were families recovering bones. There was no mystery anymore. I wish there had been. Sometimes an unexplained bad smell is better than an explanation. Sometimes you do not want to know what you were sitting on in the dark. That first night also gave me an early sense of the history already buried in the place before we arrived. We were newcomers. We were setting up a camp. From our perspective, the golf course and compound were tactical ground. Walls, openings, lines of sight, defensive positions. But the land had existed long before we got there. People had lived there, died there, buried their families there. The graveyard was part of that history. We simply did not see it in the dark. There is a certain arrogance that can come from looking at land only in terms of what you need it for. We needed a hole. So, a bulldozer dug one. But to somebody else, that same patch of ground was where a loved one had been buried. I do not say that to blame anyone. Again, it was poorly marked. No one intended to disturb graves. But the experience stayed with me because it showed how quickly one place can mean completely different things to different people. To us that night, it was protection. To the families the next morning, it was loss. I sometimes wonder whether the people who came to claim the remains knew how the graves had been disturbed. Maybe someone explained it. Maybe they were furious. Maybe they were simply focused on recovering what they could. I do not know. I was only watching the activity from a distance while getting ready for the day. But I understood enough. What had been an uncomfortable night for me had become something much more painful for them. Over time, many memories from deployments blur together. Places, shifts, faces, days where nothing happened. But some memories stay sharp because of one detail. For me, this one is simple. A bad smell, jagged rocks, then daylight. That is all it takes to bring the entire experience back. I can picture myself climbing into that fighting hole. I can remember thinking the guys before us were complaining too much. Then the smell hit. They had been right. It was awful. I remember trying to settle in, moving because something sharp was digging into me. Adjusting again. Another sharp piece. Annoying, uncomfortable, nothing more. Then hours later, after sleeping, I walked outside and saw people gathered around the exact same position. The truth was waiting for me in daylight. We had been sitting in a graveyard. The smell had been human decomposition. The rocks had been bone. Even now, saying it, that simply makes my stomach turn. There was nothing supernatural about it. No ghost, no strange figure in the darkness, no unexplained sound. Just something completely real. And sometimes, reality is worse. If I had seen a ghost near that hole, maybe I could have told myself I imagined it. But there was no imagining the families collecting remains. There was no imagining the bones. The dead had been physically there beneath us. The bulldozer had brought them back into the open. For several hours, without knowing it, we shared a fighting position with them. That was my first night in Somalia. I spent it watching the darkness outside a damaged compound, expecting that if anything frightening happened, it would come from beyond the walls. I was wrong. The thing I would remember for years was already in the ground. And all night long, we had mistaken pieces of it for rocks. Many strange and unexplained things have happened to me and different members of my family over the years, but there is one story that never fails to make me uncomfortable whenever I hear it again. It is not even my own experience. It happened to my aunt. Still, every time she tells the story, I get the same reaction. My palms start sweating, my eyes water, and I feel this deep sense of fear that is difficult to explain. There is something about the story that gets to me. Maybe it is because there is no obvious monster in it. No one is attacked. No ghost appears in the road. There is no shadowy figure standing outside the car. Instead, something much simpler happens. A group of intelligent, educated adults tries to drive back to their hotel, and somehow they cannot. My aunt has always insisted that this story is completely true. She is not the type of person I would normally expect to make up a strange supernatural experience either. She spent most of her professional life as a middle school science teacher. Science was not simply a subject she taught because it was her job. She genuinely loved it. She was interested in almost every part of the natural world: botany, geology, archaeology, anything that involved learning about the earth, plants, ancient civilizations, rocks, fossils, or the way the natural world worked fascinated her. She was always curious, always learning. During the years she worked as a teacher, the school district sometimes offered summer workshops for teachers. These programs gave educators a chance to travel, learn something new, and bring that knowledge back into their classrooms. My aunt loved opportunities like that. One particular summer, she signed up for a workshop in New Mexico. I do not remember every detail of what they were studying, but it involved field work. The group spent their days outside visiting different sites, examining the land, and doing the kind of hands-on work that would appeal to people interested in science. My aunt traveled there with several other teachers. They were all adults, educated people. Most of them were experienced travelers. This is important because when I tell this story, I do not want it to sound like one person got confused on a lonely road and panicked. There was an entire group in the vehicle. They all experienced the same thing. One night, after a long and exhausting day of field studies, my aunt and the other teachers packed up and started heading back toward their hotel. Their hotel was somewhere near Roswell. It was already very late, around midnight. They had been outside most of the day and were tired. The kind of tired where your entire body feels heavy and everyone in the car becomes quieter than usual. They wanted showers, beds, sleep, nothing more. Luckily, the hotel was not supposed to be very far from the site where they had been working. Because the route seemed simple and the distance was short, no one thought they needed a map. This happened before GPS devices and smartphones were part of everyday life. You could not simply pull out your phone, open an app, and watch a little blue dot show you exactly where you were. If you got lost, you either needed a paper map, clear directions, or someone who recognized the area. But my aunt and the group were not worried. They had traveled the same general route earlier in the day. They remembered several landmarks. The hotel was nearby. What could possibly go wrong? They got into their vehicle and started driving. The roads were quiet. It was around midnight, so there was very little traffic. New Mexico can feel incredibly open at night. During the day, the wide landscape can be beautiful. At night, especially away from major cities, that openness can become unsettling. The sky feels enormous. The darkness seems to continue forever. A road can stretch ahead of you with almost nothing around it. No buildings, no people, very few lights, just the car, the road, and whatever the headlights reveal directly in front of you. Still, the group was not frightened. Not at first. They were simply tired. As they drove, they eventually reached a four-way stop. On one corner stood a small convenience store. It was old and run down. Nothing impressive. The kind of little roadside store you might pass without giving it much attention. My aunt described it as a rinky-dink little place. The important thing was that everyone recognized it. Earlier that day, while traveling to their field site, they had passed the same store. That gave them confidence. They knew where they were. At least, they thought they did. Someone in the car probably said something like, "There it is." The store became a landmark, proof that they were on the right route. When they reached the four-way stop, they went straight. No one was worried. The hotel should not have been far. They continued driving. The road stretched ahead. It was dark. Everyone was probably thinking about getting back to the hotel and going to sleep. About 10 minutes passed. Then they saw lights ahead. A building appeared beside the road. As the vehicle got closer, someone noticed something strange. It looked familiar. They passed the building. It was the convenience store. The same convenience store. My aunt and the other teachers looked at one another. For a moment, no one was frightened. They laughed. They had been working outside all day. It had been hot. They were tired. Maybe the sun and exhaustion had affected them more than they realized. Maybe they had confused one store with another. That seemed like the obvious explanation. After all, small convenience stores can look similar. Maybe there were two of them in the area. Maybe they had somehow missed a turn. Maybe they only thought it was the same place. There was no reason to panic. They continued straight. The group was still confident. They joked about their memory. Someone may have blamed the long day. Maybe they were simply too tired to pay attention. 10 more minutes passed. Again, they drove through the darkness. Again, they expected to eventually see their hotel or another familiar road. Instead, lights appeared ahead. Another intersection. Another small building. The car approached, and once again, they passed the same convenience store. This time, no one laughed as much. The store looked exactly the same. Same building, same location, same four-way stop. They had driven straight for approximately 10 minutes. Then somehow returned to the place where they had started. Now the group became confused. Maybe they had accidentally driven in a circle. But how? They had gone straight. At least everyone believed they had. Maybe the road curved gradually enough that they had not noticed. That was possible. Roads do strange things. A route that feels straight can sometimes bend over several miles and eventually bring you back toward the same area. That explanation was not impossible. But the group was beginning to feel uncomfortable. They reached the four-way stop again. This time, they decided to change direction. Instead of continuing straight, they turned right. That should solve the problem. Whatever strange loop they had accidentally been following, a right turn would take them somewhere different. They drove. The road continued into the darkness. Minutes passed. Everyone watched more carefully now. No one was casually talking. They were looking for signs, buildings, road names, anything that could tell them where they were. Then the convenience store appeared again. The same store. My aunt could not understand it. They had turned right. They should have been traveling in a completely different direction. Yet somehow the little store was there again, waiting beside another four-way stop. Or perhaps the same four-way stop. At this point, The group was no longer amused. Something felt wrong. Maybe they were badly lost. Maybe the roads were arranged in some confusing pattern. But everyone had the same growing feeling that what was happening did not make sense. They reached the intersection again. This time they tried another direction. They turned left. Surely that would change things. If going straight brought them back, and turning right brought them back, then turning left had to lead somewhere else. They drove into the night. Again, the darkness surrounded the vehicle. The headlights moved across empty road. The teachers watched carefully. Nobody wanted to see the store again. But eventually, there it was. The same old convenience store. Again, at that point, my aunt began to feel genuinely frightened. She described it later as feeling like she had somehow entered an episode of The Twilight Zone. Reality seemed normal in every way except for one impossible detail. They could not get away from that store. No matter which direction they chose, the road seemed to bring them back. Straight, right, left, it did not matter. The same building kept appearing. My aunt said it began to feel like the convenience store was not a real place anymore. It felt like a prop, something placed there deliberately as part of some enormous joke. Except no one was laughing. Imagine being in that vehicle. It is after midnight. You are in an unfamiliar part of New Mexico. GPS does not exist. You do not have a map. You know the hotel should be close. You keep choosing different roads. Yet somehow, you continue returning to the exact same place. The same store. The same intersection. Again and again. At first, your mind searches for normal explanations. Maybe we turned without noticing. Maybe the roads connect in a circle. Maybe there are several similar stores. Maybe we are more tired than we thought. But eventually, those explanations stop feeling convincing. How many identical convenience stores could there be within such a small area? Why would each one sit beside what looked like the same four-way stop? Why did every route seem to take approximately the same amount of time before returning them? The group was made up of teachers, people trained to think carefully, people who were used to observing details. Yet none of them could make sense of what was happening. They began paying closer attention to the store. Was it actually the same building? Maybe they looked at the signs, the shape, the parking area. Any small detail that could prove there were several similar stores. But everything seemed familiar. It was the same place. Or at least, that was how it appeared. I do not know exactly how many times they passed it. My aunt has always described it as happening again and again. Enough times that everyone became seriously disturbed. The car had gone from a place of tired conversation to a place of nervous silence. I imagine people began questioning one another. Didn't we just turn right? Wasn't that the same store? Are we going in circles? How is this possible? No one had a good answer. The darkness outside probably made everything worse. During the day, they could have used the landscape. Mountains, distant structures, the position of the sun. Anything at midnight, the world beyond the headlights was mostly invisible. The road existed only as far as they could see in front of them. Everything else was darkness. That little convenience store became the only stable landmark. And that was exactly the problem. It was always there. My aunt told the story as if the store itself seemed to be following them. Of course, logically, a building cannot move. The car was moving. They were the ones getting lost. That is what had to be happening. But from inside the experience, it felt different. It felt like they were trapped inside a small piece of geography that refused to let them leave. Every road returned to the same point. The store became almost threatening simply because of how often it appeared. A normal building had turned into something frightening. I have wondered what it must have looked like from inside. Was the store open? Were the lights on? Was anyone working there? My aunt never focused much on those details when she told the story. The important thing was the building itself, its repeated appearance. Personally, I think that almost makes the story creepier. Imagine if the store was open the entire time. Imagine someone working the night shift inside, watching the same vehicle pass again and again. Did they notice? Did they wonder why those people kept driving past? Or was the store closed? Dark, empty, just sitting beside the road like a marker they could not escape? I do not know. I am not even completely sure how the group finally made it back to the hotel. That part of the story has always been unclear. Maybe eventually they chose the correct road. Maybe someone recognized another landmark. Maybe they finally found a sign. Maybe they stopped somewhere for directions. My aunt never emphasized the escape as much as the experience itself. What mattered to her was that at some point, the loop ended. They eventually returned to the hotel. But she never forgot the feeling of being trapped. I imagine arriving at the hotel must have been an enormous relief. Bright lights, a parking lot, other people, a real destination. After spending what felt like forever driving through dark roads and repeatedly returning to the same convenience store, seeing the hotel must have felt like returning to normal reality. They probably talked about what had happened. Maybe they tried to reconstruct the route. Maybe they laughed nervously once they were safe. Maybe someone suggested that they had simply been exhausted. That is the easiest explanation. They had spent all day doing field studies. They were tired. It was late. They were driving unfamiliar roads without a map. Under those conditions, it would be easy to become disoriented. That is probably what happened. At least, that is what I tell myself. There may have been a road system around the four-way stop that created several large loops. Maybe they thought they were taking different routes, but were accidentally entering roads that all connected back to the same intersection. It is completely possible. Human memory is not perfect either. Maybe after the first time they returned to the store, everyone became anxious. Once they were anxious, each new intersection started looking like the same place. Maybe there were 2 or 3 similar stores, and exhaustion made them believe they were seeing one building repeatedly. That is another possible explanation. But my aunt never seemed satisfied with those answers. She was there. She saw it. So did the other teachers. To her, it was the same store, every time. And the roads did not feel like they were looping. They felt like they were choosing different directions. Yet somehow, they always returned. Years later, when she told the story, she still described the experience with genuine discomfort. She would say, it felt like being in the twilight zone. That phrase always stayed with me, not because something supernatural visibly happened, but because normal reality seemed to stop following its own rules. That is one of the most frightening ideas to me. A ghost is frightening because you do not understand what it is. A monster is frightening because it might hurt you. But what happens when the road itself stops making sense? What do you do when direction no longer works? When left, right, and straight all lead to the same place? You cannot fight that. You cannot run from it. You cannot lock the doors and wait for it to leave. You are already inside it. I think that is why my aunt's story affects me so strongly. They were not being chased. Nothing attacked the car. They were simply trying to get back to their hotel. A basic task, something people do every day. But for some amount of time, the world seemed to become a loop. The store appeared. They passed it. 10 minutes later, it appeared again. They changed direction. There it was. They changed direction again. There it was again. At some point, you have to imagine the fear inside that vehicle. One person probably stopped making jokes first, then another. Eventually, nobody was laughing. I wonder if they considered stopping at the store, maybe going inside, asking the clerk where they were. That might have solved everything. But perhaps the place felt too strange by then. If I had already passed the same store several impossible times, I am not sure I would want to walk inside either. What would you even say? We keep leaving here, but somehow we keep coming back. Maybe the clerk would laugh and explain the roads. Maybe they would say it happened to tourists all the time. That would have been comforting. Or maybe the store was closed. Maybe there was nobody to ask. The story leaves me with too many questions. I have also wondered whether the location near Roswell adds something to the feeling. Roswell already has a reputation for strange stories. Aliens, UFOs, military secrets. People hear the name and immediately think about unexplained events. But my aunt's story had nothing to do with aliens. There were no lights in the sky, no missing time that she mentioned, no strange creatures, just roads, and a convenience store. Still, knowing the general area somehow makes the whole thing feel even stranger. Maybe that is unfair. New Mexico is a large place filled with normal people and normal roads. Not every strange story near Roswell needs to become some alien mystery. But the setting gives the memory a certain atmosphere. A group of teachers driving through the New Mexico darkness near midnight. No GPS, no map, almost no traffic. Then the same lonely store appearing again and again. It is difficult not to picture it. I imagine the headlights sweeping across the building each time. The first time, everyone feels relieved, a familiar landmark. The second time, they laugh. How strange. The third time, the laughter becomes nervous. The fourth time, nobody says much. Eventually, the building itself becomes something they dread seeing. They look ahead into the darkness, hoping for anything else. A gas station, a house, a hotel, a sign. Then the shape of that same little store appears again. That would be enough to make anyone question what was happening. I think my aunt's scientific background makes the story more interesting, too. She was not someone who spent her life searching for paranormal experiences. She liked evidence. She liked the natural world. She taught science. She understood that strange events usually have explanations. But even she never found an explanation that fully satisfied her. Maybe if she had been alone, she could have blamed exhaustion. But there were several people in the vehicle. They all saw the same store. They all knew which directions they were taking. And they all experienced the same growing confusion. Shared experiences are harder to dismiss. Of course, groups can influence one another. One person says, "That looks like the same store." Then everyone starts believing it. That happens too. Maybe that is all it was. But there is still something deeply unsettling about the image. A road that refuses to take you anywhere new. A landmark you cannot leave behind. A group of people slowly realizing they may not understand where they are. My aunt eventually made it back. Everyone did. Nothing physically bad happened to them. No one disappeared. No one was injured. In that sense, the story has a happy ending. But fear does not always require tragedy. Sometimes the frightening part is simply realizing that for a short time, you have lost your understanding of how the world works. My aunt knew roads. She knew directions. She knew they had gone straight, then right, then left. Yet there was the store. Always the store. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if they had kept driving until sunrise. Would the loop have continued? Would daylight have revealed that they were traveling in circles? Would mountains or signs have made everything obvious? Maybe the entire mystery existed only because it was dark. That is probably true. Daylight exposes things. A road that feels endless at midnight may look completely ordinary in the morning. Maybe if my aunt had returned to the exact same area the next day, she would have immediately understood what happened. Perhaps there were several intersections arranged in a confusing pattern. Maybe the store stood at the center of a road system that naturally caused lost drivers to circle back. I do not know if she ever returned. Part of me wishes she had. Another part is glad she did not. Some mysteries are more powerful because they remain unresolved. Years later, the store still exists in the story, almost like a symbol. Not because of what was inside, not because anyone there did anything, but because they could not get away from it. I think about how frightening ordinary objects become when something about them is wrong. A chair facing a direction you do not remember leaving it. A door that opens by itself. A telephone ringing when the line is disconnected. A familiar convenience store appearing where it should not be. The object itself is harmless. The wrongness is what scares you. My aunt has never claimed to know what happened. She does not say they entered another dimension. She does not say the roads were haunted. She does not claim the store was supernatural. She simply tells the story. They were driving back to their hotel. They recognized the store. They went straight. They saw it again. They kept going. They saw it again. They turned. There it was. They turned another way. There it was again. Eventually, somehow, they escaped the loop and made it back. That is all. Maybe one day someone familiar with the roads near Roswell could explain exactly where they were. Maybe there is a perfectly logical route that creates the illusion of returning to the same place. I would honestly be relieved to hear it. But until then, I only have my aunt's story. And every time I imagine being inside that vehicle, I feel the same chill. The first appearance of the store would not bother me. The second would make me laugh. The third would make me nervous. But after that, after turning right and seeing it again, after turning left and watching that same little building appear in the headlights one more time, I think I would stop laughing entirely. Because there comes a point when being lost stops feeling like being lost. It starts feeling like being trapped. And according to my aunt, for one strange night in New Mexico, that is exactly how it felt. A group of tired teachers drove through the darkness looking for their hotel. No matter which road they chose, the same old convenience store seemed to be waiting for them. Again and again and again. My aunt eventually returned home safely. She continued teaching science. Life went on normally. But she never forgot that night. And whenever she tells the story, I can still picture that little store sitting alone beside a four-way stop in the middle of the New Mexico darkness, waiting for them to come back. I used to work in a nursing home, and during my time there, I experienced something that I still cannot fully explain. Working in a nursing home changes the way you think about strange stories. You spend your days around elderly people from all kinds of backgrounds. Some residents are mentally sharp and completely aware of everything happening around them. Others suffer from dementia, memory loss, or other conditions that can cause confusion. Because of that, you sometimes hear unusual things. A resident might insist that someone came into their room when nobody did. Another might talk to a family member who passed away years ago. Sometimes they wake from dreams and believe what they saw was real. When you work in that environment long enough, you learn not to overreact to every strange comment. Most of the time, there is a reasonable explanation. That was exactly how I treated it when one of our residents refused to get on to the elevator with me. I was helping her get somewhere in the building, and when we reached the elevator, she suddenly stopped. She would not go inside. I asked her what was wrong. She told me she was scared of the little boy. I looked into the elevator. It was empty. There was no boy, no child anywhere nearby. At first, I assumed she was confused. Maybe she had seen another resident earlier and mistaken them for a child. Maybe she was remembering something from years ago. Maybe she was afraid of elevators and had created a reason not to get on. I did not think much about it. I simply shrugged it off. Working in a nursing home, you hear things like that. You cannot stop everything you are doing every time someone says they see a person who is not there. So I moved on. I probably would have forgotten the whole incident if another resident had not said something similar. Not long after that, a male resident came out of his room while I was working. He looked at me and asked if I had any candy. That was not particularly unusual. Residents sometimes asked for snacks. But then he explained why he wanted it. He wanted candy for the little boy. That got my attention. I asked him what boy he was talking about. From the way he spoke, he seemed to believe there was a child nearby. Again, I looked around. There was no little boy. There should not have been one. This was a nursing home. Children sometimes visited family members, of course, but there was no child wandering around at that moment. Now I had two different residents mentioning a little boy. One resident had been afraid of him near the elevator. Another wanted to give him candy. That felt like more than a random comment. Still, I was not ready to believe anything supernatural was happening. There could have been a simple explanation. Maybe the residents had spoken to each other. Maybe someone had recently brought a child in to visit. Maybe both of them were referring to the same real boy they had seen earlier. But something about it bothered me enough that I decided to ask my mother. My mother worked at the same nursing home. She was a charge nurse and had been employed there for 13 years. If anyone knew the history of the place, she did. She had worked with countless residents over the years. She had seen employees come and go. She knew the building. She knew the stories. So I asked her if she knew anything about residents talking about a little boy. Her reaction immediately made me uncomfortable. She knew exactly who I meant. According to my mother, reports of the little boy had been happening for years. Not weeks, not months. Years throughout her entire time working there, residents would occasionally report seeing a young boy somewhere in the facility. The details were remarkably consistent. He was young. He wanted to play. He would appear near residents and speak to them. Sometimes people would mention him casually, as if seeing a child in the nursing home was completely normal. Other residents seemed frightened by him. The strange part was that the reports did not come only from people with dementia. That would have made the story easier to dismiss. If every person who saw the little boy had severe memory problems or hallucinations, you could reasonably assume their medical conditions explained it. But that was not the case. According to my mother, residents of all different mental states had reported him. Some had severe dementia. Others were mentally sharp. Some knew exactly where they were, who they were speaking to, and what was happening around them. Yet over the years, completely different people continued describing the same young boy. That was what made the story so unsettling. These residents did not all live there at the same time. Some passed away. New residents arrived. Years went by. Yet the reports continued. A little boy, wanting to play, appearing where no child should be. My mother told me that employees had become used to hearing about him. It had almost become part of the nursing home's history. Not everyone believed the stories, of course. Some probably thought it was coincidence. Others might have believed residents were influencing one another. Maybe one person talked about a boy, another overheard it, and eventually the story spread. That would make sense. But then my mother told me something even stranger. At some point, the nursing home moved to a different facility, a completely different building. If the little boy had been connected to the original nursing home, you would expect the sightings to stop. Maybe the old building had a history. Maybe there was something about the structure that caused strange shadows. Maybe sounds traveled in ways that confused residents. Moving should have ended all of that. It did not. The little boy came with them. After residents and staff moved into the new facility, people continued reporting the same child. That detail has always bothered me. Buildings can have stories attached to them. People talk about haunted hospitals, old houses, schools, hotels. Maybe something happened on the land. Maybe a person died there. There are countless explanations people use when they believe a place is haunted. But if the reports continued after moving to another building, then whatever residents were experiencing was apparently not tied to the original location. It seemed connected to the nursing home itself. Or perhaps to the people. I asked my mother what residents usually said about the boy. Over the years, more details had apparently emerged. The little boy seemed especially drawn to residents who had poor eyesight. People with limited vision seemed to report him more often or provide longer conversations involving him. That might have a completely normal explanation. When someone's eyesight is poor, shadows and shapes can easily be mistaken for people. A coat hanging on a chair becomes a figure. Movement in the hallway becomes a child. The brain fills in missing details. That would be the logical way to look at it. But according to my mother, some of these residents gave surprisingly specific descriptions. The boy had very dark black hair. He told people that he lived in a tent. And according to what residents said, he told them how he had died. A tree had fallen on him. That was the story. A little boy with dark black hair, living in a tent, killed when a tree fell on him. Different residents apparently repeated these details over a long period of time. That is where the story became difficult for me to dismiss. How were people who did not know each other describing the same child? How were they repeating the same story? Maybe employees talked about him around residents. That is possible. Maybe the story became part of the facility's culture, and residents picked it up without anyone realizing it. People remember things they hear, even when they do not remember where they heard them. Someone might hear a nurse joking about the ghost boy, then later believe the memory belongs to them. That could explain some of it. But the idea still unsettled me, especially because before I asked my mother, I had already heard 2 residents mention him independently. The woman near the elevator had been afraid. The man wanted candy for him. 2 completely different reactions. Neither of them had given me a dramatic ghost story. They had simply behaved as if a child was there. That made it feel more believable somehow. The woman did not say, "I see a ghost." She said she was scared of the little boy. The man did not tell me the nursing home was haunted. He asked me for candy to give to a child. To them, the boy seemed real. After my mother told me the history, I started paying more attention. I would walk through the hallways and think about the stories. Sometimes I would look toward an empty doorway and wonder if someone else saw a child standing there. The nursing home felt different at night. Most medical facilities do. During the day, there is constant movement. Employees, visitors, meals being served, televisions playing, phones ringing. At night, everything becomes quieter. The hallways feel longer. Many residents are asleep. Lights are dimmed. Every small sound becomes easier to notice. I never actually saw the boy myself, at least not in the way residents described him. I never looked down a hallway and saw a child with black hair. I never heard a little boy asking me to play. Part of me was relieved. Another part became curious. If so many people claimed to see him, What were they actually seeing? Was it a shared story, a hallucination, a coincidence? Or was there really something there? Then one night, something happened that changed the story for me completely. I was helping feed a female resident. She had recently suffered a stroke. The stroke had seriously affected her physical abilities. She had lost the use of her right hand and needed complete assistance with certain activities, including eating. I was sitting with her, helping her take her food one bite at a time. It was a normal part of my job. Nothing unusual was happening. The room was calm. I was focused on feeding her. Then, I felt something touch my arm. A hand. A cold hand. The sensation was clear. It felt like someone had placed their hand directly on me. I froze. Before I could even fully react, the resident looked toward the area near me. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Is that your boyfriend?" I stared at her. Then she added that he looked a little young for me. My entire body went cold. I immediately thought of the little boy. There was no one standing beside me. No boyfriend. No child. Nothing, but I had just felt a cold hand touch my arm. And at exactly that moment, the resident acted as though she could see a young male standing next to me. I nearly lost it. All those stories my mother had told me came rushing back at once. The elevator, the candy, the little boy who wanted to play, the dark hair, the tent, the tree, the years of residents claiming to see him, the move to a different building. Now I was sitting beside a woman who apparently saw someone next to me at the exact moment I felt an unexplained hand on my arm. I did not know what to say. Part of me wanted to turn around. Another part absolutely did not. I knew there was nobody there. At least, nobody I could see. I tried to stay calm. I was working. The resident needed me. I could not simply run out of the room, but inside, I was terrified. The touch had been cold. That is the detail I remember most clearly. Not a breeze, not fabric brushing against me. A hand. At least, that was how it felt. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the resident's comment changed the way I remembered the sensation. That is possible. Human memory can be unreliable, especially during frightening moments. Maybe something cold touched my arm, a piece of equipment, the edge of the bed, an air current. Then the resident made a strange comment, and my brain connected the two events. But in my memory, the sequence is clear. First, the hand, then her voice. "Is that your boyfriend?" And then the comment about him being too young for me. I knew exactly who she seemed to be talking about. The little boy. I cannot remember exactly what I said to her afterward. Maybe I asked who she meant. Maybe I tried to laugh it off. What I remember is the fear. I wanted to leave that room. I wanted to find my mother and tell her what had happened. I wanted a normal explanation. But there was another part of the story that made the experience much more disturbing. The resident I was feeding died that night. She passed away. I have thought about that connection many times. I do not know whether it means anything. People in nursing homes die. That is unfortunately part of the reality of working in one. Many residents are elderly, many are seriously ill. This woman had recently suffered a stroke. Her health was already fragile. Her death did not require a supernatural explanation. There was a clear medical reason why she could have passed away. I understand that. But the timing stayed with me. On the night she died, she saw a young boy standing beside me. The same kind of boy residents had reportedly been seeing for years. At the same moment, I felt a cold hand touch my arm. Then, before the night was over, she was gone. That is difficult to forget. I have wondered whether other residents who saw the boy died soon afterward. I do not know. My mother never told me that he was considered some kind of warning or sign of death. From what I understood, he appeared to all kinds of people at different times. Sometimes he simply wanted to play. Some residents apparently saw him repeatedly, so I do not believe his presence automatically meant someone was about to die. Still, in this particular case, that was what happened. I think the thing that frightens me most is that the boy never sounded threatening. He was not described as angry. He did not attack anyone. He did not scream. He wanted to play. He asked for candy. He appeared like a child. There is something sad about that. If the residents' stories were somehow true, then perhaps he was simply lonely. Maybe he appeared around elderly people because they were the ones who could see him. Maybe he stayed close to people with limited eyesight because, for some strange reason, they noticed him more easily. Maybe he wanted attention. Those thoughts are almost comforting. Then I remember the woman who refused to enter the elevator because she was scared of him. Why was she afraid? Did she see something different? Did he do something? Or was she simply frightened because she knew no child should have been there? Seeing an unknown little boy wandering through a nursing home could be unsettling even if he did nothing wrong, especially if nobody else could see him. The detail about the tent has always interested me too. Why would a child say he lived in a tent? Was his family camping? Was he from a time when people lived differently? Was tent simply the word a confused resident used to describe something else? And what about the tree? He supposedly said a tree fell on him and killed him. That is such a specific detail. Where did it come from? Maybe one resident invented the story. Then others heard it. Over time, the details became repeated until they seemed like independent reports. That is probably one of the most logical explanations. Stories spread, especially in close communities. A nursing home is its own small world. Residents talk, employees talk, families visit. Someone tells one strange story, and years later, nobody remembers where it started. Maybe the little boy never existed at all. Maybe he became a legend inside the facility. But then why did he seem to follow them when they moved? Again, perhaps the story moved because the people moved. The staff carried it. Residents carried it. The legend belonged to the community, not the building. That explanation actually makes sense. Yet I still cannot explain my own experience. I did not see him. That is important. Maybe if I had seen a full figure, I would question whether I was tired or imagining things. Instead, I felt something, a cold hand. Then someone else apparently saw the person touching me. That is what made it so frightening. Two different senses. My physical sensation, her visual experience, happening at the same moment. There could still be a coincidence. Maybe my arm suddenly became cold because of air conditioning. Maybe the resident was confused because of her stroke. Maybe she saw a shadow. Maybe she was looking at a photograph or object behind me and interpreted it as a young man. Her brain had been injured. Visual confusion would not have been impossible. Then she happened to make the comment at the same moment I felt something strange. Coincidences happen. I know that. But knowing possible explanations does not erase the memory. I can still remember sitting there, holding the food, helping her eat, feeling that cold touch. Then hearing her ask if the person beside me was my boyfriend. I remember the way my stomach tightened when she said he looked too young for me. There was no young man in the room. There was only the story of a little boy who had been appearing to residents for years. After she passed away, I could not stop thinking about it. Had she seen him because she was close to death? Was he there for her? That sounds like something from a ghost story, and I hesitate even writing it. I do not know what I believe. Maybe dying people see things because of changes happening in the brain. Maybe they see people from their memories. Maybe they hallucinate. There are medical explanations for many end-of-life experiences. But the boy she seemed to see was not someone from her family, as far as I knew. She thought he belonged to me. Is that your boyfriend? She was trying to understand who this young person was. That suggests he was unfamiliar to her. Then there is the age comment. Too young for me. That fits perfectly with the idea of a child. I sometimes wonder what she actually saw. Did she see him clearly? Was he standing? Was he touching my arm? What did his face look like? Did he have the dark hair other residents described? I will never know. She died that same night. There was no chance to ask later. Maybe that is part of why the experience stayed with me. The last person who could have explained what she saw was gone before morning. I have also thought about my mother working there for 13 years. Imagine hearing these stories over and over. One resident mentions a boy. Years later, another describes him. A new resident arrives and reports the same thing. The facility moves. The reports continue. Eventually, you stop being surprised. That was almost how my mother talked about it. The little boy was just something residents sometimes saw. That casual acceptance made the whole thing creepier to me. This was not one dramatic ghost sighting. It was a pattern. Quiet, repeated, spread across years. Different residents, different mental conditions. Same child. Working in elder care already puts you close to death in a way many people never experience. Residents become part of your daily routine. You help them eat. You help them dress. You talk to them. You learn their habits. Then sometimes they pass away. The room that was occupied yesterday becomes empty. A new resident eventually moves in. Life continues. Perhaps that environment naturally creates stories about ghosts. There is so much memory concentrated in one place, so much loss, so many people coming and going. It would be surprising if strange stories did not develop. That is the rational part of me speaking. Then the other part remembers the cold hand. I cannot argue with the feeling. I felt it. Maybe the cause was ordinary, but the sensation itself was real. Something cold touched my arm, and before I could say anything, the woman in front of me looked at someone I could not see. That is why I still think about the little boy. I do not know if he was real. I do not know if dozens of residents actually saw the same thing. I only know what I was told. And I know what happened to me. One resident was too frightened to ride an elevator because of a little boy. Another wanted candy for him. My mother told me the same boy had been reported for years. He had dark hair. He wanted to play. He supposedly lived in a tent. He said a tree had killed him. And somehow, when the nursing home changed buildings, he apparently came along. Then, one night, while I was feeding a woman who had recently suffered a stroke, I felt a cold hand on my arm. At that exact moment, she looked toward the empty space beside me. "Is that your boyfriend?" Then she told me he looked a little young for me. She died before the night was over. Maybe every part of it has an explanation. Maybe the little boy was nothing more than a story passed between residents and employees. Maybe my experience was coincidence. I hope so. But whenever I think about that nursing home, I still imagine a little boy walking through the hallways. Dark black hair. Looking for someone to play with. Stopping beside residents who can barely see. Asking for candy. Talking about the tent where he lived. Telling them about the tree that fell on him. And sometimes I wonder whether on that final night, he really did stand beside me. Maybe that cold hand was his. Maybe the woman saw him clearly, even though I could not. I will never know. All I know is that she looked at the empty space next to me like someone was standing there. And before morning, She was dead.